Chapter 490. From the lounge to the lecture room, Xia Jinyuan carefully searched for traces left behind by Yi Qian and began to analyze the situation logically. The gun was found here, which means that it was left behind when the other party was not paying attention to her. There are also hairs on the gun, which means that Yi Qian left the gun behind on purpose and fell to the ground on purpose. Then, she quickly wrapped a strand of hair around the gun and placed the 6 strands of hair together. J5 squatted by the door frame where Yi Qian fell and nodded slightly in agreement with Xia Jinyuan's deduction. There are traces of saliva here and a piece of carpet fabric that was pulled out. She did do 3 things at the same time. First, she left the gun as a warning. Second, she left a clue. Third, she reported that she was safe. In the face of at least 4 criminals, she was able to remain calm in such a short time. She even left a clue and told the Shuayu team that she had left voluntarily. No wonder Q King called her a little fox. Yi Jian's cleverness and alertness were evident from the crime scene investigation. The furnishings in the room were not damaged at all and there were no signs of a struggle. 2 bodies were found in the pantry of the lecture room. They were the bodyguards responsible for the safety of Miss Petty and Miss 24. They died of suffocation and were attacked by more than 4 criminals who successfully killed the 2 bodyguards who were completely unprepared for Pavel. It's good that we can be sure that Yi Qian left with them voluntarily. At least we can be sure that they are safe for the time being. J5 walked out of the pantry with 4 gray robes in his hands. 4 adult men wearing gray robes snuck in. The 2 bodyguards were not wearing white robes. 2 of them must have disguised themselves as bodyguards and successfully fooled Yi Qian. Xia Jinyuan shook his head and said calmly, "No, Yi Qian would not be fooled so easily. She is very sensitive to smells. Pakistani people have a strong body odor. We may not be able to tell the difference, but she definitely can." Just now, the Pakistani staff said that Yi Qian sent Petty into the small room and waited for the 2 bodyguards to enter before she left with the Pakistani staff. After walking less than 2 meters, Petty ran out alone and said that Pavel invited Yi Qian to attend her class. The Pakistani staff asked the president for permission, and the president agreed after 5 minutes. Before he could finish his sentence, J5, G3, and K7 all understood what was going on. Petty came out alone, and in the 5 minutes she waited for the president's permission, the 2 bodyguards were strangled by Pavel's men who took off their white robes and disguised them. When Yi Jian entered the room, 2 criminals in disguise were standing in a place she could not see. At this time, Yi Jian had already entered the small room. It was impossible for her to retreat when she noticed something strange. Because she saw Petty was in Pavel's hands. Inform the Snowfield Brigade in charge of security to send 2 men to protect the leader. J5, you stay here. Q King, K7, you 2 will be in charge of external support after you confirm the identities of the criminals. Xia Jinyuan began to make arrangements. His outstanding leadership skills had already won the trust of the Snowfield Brigade, and they would all obey his orders. Okay, no problem. Several voices came from his earpiece. They were the voices of his comrades from the Snowfield Brigade who had arrived at the presidential palace early and were secretly protecting the leader. Chapter 491. When the person in charge of security sent by Ba Fong came over with Pavel's personal information, Xia Jinyuan and the other 3 had already analyzed the entire situation. Without them seeing it, the match rate was as high as 95%. This was the tacit understanding between Yi Qian and Xia Jinyuan, as well as the entire Snowfield Brigade. The head of security took out Pavel's information and said worriedly with a frown, Pavel was the former Mrs. President's English teacher during the old regime. She was highly rated. We reviewed her personal information and confirmed that there was no problem with her identity before we continued to hire her. None of us, including Mrs. President, expected her to be such a terrifying person. You can't tell if a person is terrifying from their appearance. You can only know if they are terrifying if you investigate them thoroughly. Xia Jinyuan took out Pavel's personal information. When his gaze landed on the first row of her husband's personal information, his dark eyes narrowed. He said to J5, Pavel wrote down the time of her father-in-law's death in the war. Xia Jinyuan pursed his lips and said coldly, this date coincides with the conflict between the government and the Al-Qaeda organization. Look at her husband's photo and her husband's younger brother's photo. The two brothers are twins. The older brother is Pavel's husband, a government soldier. Her husband's younger brother is a taxi driver. The faces in the two photos look like they were taken from the same person. Their facial features and expressions were almost identical. The only difference was that one of them had a beard, while the other didn't. The one with a beard was Pavel's husband, who was wearing a Pakistani military uniform, while her husband's younger brother was wearing a white robe. K7 narrowed his eyes. Government soldiers are not allowed to have beards. He then asked the person in charge of the presidential palace's security in English, why do you have a beard as a government soldier? Didn't you investigate this? What if Pavel's husband was a taxi driver and her brother was a government soldier? As soon as K7 finished his question, beads of sweat rolled down the security officer's forehead. He looked at the security officer and then slowly lowered his head to look at the two photos. His lips trembled slightly. Pavel's husband's younger brother is a member of Al-Qaeda. No, Pavel's husband is an Al-Qaeda member, and his brother is a real government soldier. Xia Jinyuan looked at the man with a heavy gaze. His sharp gaze was like a cold arrow shooting into the man's eyes. The date of her husband's death was the same as the date of the largest battle between the Pakistani government and the Al-Qaeda. How could they not have discovered such a major problem? They even let Miss Petty learn English from the wife of an Al-Qaeda member. What kind of security did they do? How did they pass the review and approval process? Soon, the surveillance cameras around the small room were shown. Pavel drove out of the presidential palace from the rear exit. Then, a garbage truck slowly drove out behind her. There was no need to analyze any further. Yi Qian and Petty must be in these two vehicles. What made Xia Jinyuan even more helpless was that there were very few surveillance cameras in the entire Pakistani capital. Some had not been rebuilt due to the destruction caused by the war, and some only had surveillance cameras but were not connected. This made it very difficult to trace the whereabouts of the vehicles. Chapter 492. The members of the Snowfield Brigade didn't waste too much time on the Sky Eye. The leaders of the Snowfield Brigade were escorted back to the hotel in the castle by the special forces of the Snowfield Brigade who were in charge of security. This was a large hotel that was operated by Chinese people, but it was also funded by the Chinese government. There were a few rooms that were not open to the public. Only the leaders of the Chinese side or the senior engineers who came to support the Pakistani side could stay there. Not only was each room equipped with an individual elevator, but it was also anti-eavesdropper. The doors, walls, and glass were all bulletproof and anti-collapse. The staff of the Chinese side also stayed there. The security guards were all armed and ready. After the leader returned to the hotel room, he immediately said to Major General Liu, "I heard from them that student Xiaoya left with the base's organizers willingly. From this point alone, it can be seen that she is a brave and righteous child. We brought her out, so we must bring her back safely. Her mother, Sun Xueqing, sacrificed herself for the motherland. Today, the motherland that she protected must protect her child. Send a letter to China and immediately send an elite special forces team over to support the Pakistani side. If necessary, we will share the trials and tribulations with the Pakistani government." The hidden meaning of fully supporting the Pakistani side was that they couldn't rely on the Pakistani side. They had to rely on themselves at critical moments. The meaning of share the trials and tribulations was that they shouldn't treat this place as a foreign country when they opened fire. They shouldn't care about how many bullets were fired, how many bases organizers would be killed. As long as the Pakistani government was fighting, the special forces of China could continue to fight. In short, the soldiers sent by the Chinese side will fully support the Pakistani side. If the Pakistani side didn't rescue Miss Petty and the government didn't retreat, the soldiers sent by the Chinese side will definitely not retreat. They must live and die with the Pakistani government. The Major General quickly conveyed the leader's words to Xia Jinyuan and said earnestly, "The leader is very concerned about Xiao Ye's safety." At the same time, he also believes that with Xiao Ye's ability and performance, she will definitely protect herself and Miss Petty. You guys, carefully think about the meaning of the leader's words. The Chinese government is already sending soldiers. They won't be slow. They will arrive in about 3 hours. The Chinese people are here to represent friendship. Since there are criminals who want to destroy the friendship between the two countries, this will not be allowed. The Chinese side will definitely stand behind the Pakistani government and support them to fight against the Al-Qaeda. Since 1996, when the Chinese side recovered Hong Kong, the dragon that had been sleeping for 100 years had finally risen. The Chinese side didn't care how foreign forces interfered with other countries' affairs. However, if they dared to bully China, they would be sorry. Who would dare to say that they didn't have sufficient reasons? However, this visit was a secret, so it was better to keep a low profile. Xia Jinyuan had already digested the words of the leader. The leader couldn't speak too directly. He had to act like a big country. It was fine as long as his own people understood. Major General, please report to the higher-ups that we have a rough idea of where Pavel went. Due to the importance of this matter, the translator who stayed behind is still negotiating with the Pakistani representative. Where the place? Chapter 493. Pavel was a volunteer teacher at the school. Q King and K7 had already gone to the school, so they would be able to detect any abnormalities. The Pakistani military would send people to observe the other two places in secret, and rescue them if there were any abnormalities. After the Major General hung up the phone, he reported Xia Jinyuan's words to his superiors. Soon, an elite special forces team that arrived in Pakistan 3 hours later received orders from their superiors to head to a primary school in Pakistan's capital immediately after they got off the plane. In October, the weather in Pakistan was cool and refreshing. The average temperature during the day was 31 degrees Celsius, and it was cooler at night. It was already 5:30 in the afternoon. Yi Qian, who had just left the presidential palace, kept track of the time she saw when she was taken into the car. It had been about 2.5 hours since then. She believed that Captain Xia and the others had already roughly figured out Pavel's identity, but Yi Qian wasn't sure if they knew where she was. It was very quiet here, and she and Petty were locked in a room filled with the smell of curry and meat. She guessed that they were in the storage room behind the kitchen. It was too dark. If she hadn't been counting the time silently, she would have thought it was already dark. Her hands and feet were tied, but it wasn't a problem for Yi Qian to tie her hands behind her back. She touched the knot with both hands, and slowly, she thought about what kind of knot it was and how to quickly untie it. Yi Qian closed her eyes and didn't speak to Petty. After the knot was untied, she said softly, "Don't be afraid, Miss Petty. Sit down and rest for a while. I need to climb up to the window to see where we are." She gently touched the silver thread around her left hand with her right hand. They had searched her body, and she was very glad that she had left the pistol as a signal. Otherwise, they would have been alerted if they found a pistol on her. They even searched her watch, but they didn't take the silver thread around her left hand. They thought it was a silver bracelet. Petty didn't realize that Yi Qian had already stood up. When she spoke, her voice was trembling. Jane, we were kidnapped by Teacher Pavel. I think she might be a member of the Al-Qaeda organization. Ha! Why is this happening? Yi Qian, who was stretching his wrists, squatted down in front of her and asked softly, "What did you find?" Miss Petty. One day, I mentioned that there was a conflict between the government and Al-Qaeda. Pavel suddenly got angry and told me not to mention it in front of her again. Petty's expression should have been terrified because her voice was filled with fear. Every word she said was trembling. I think she should be a member of Al-Qaeda, but I believed her at that time because she was a very patient teacher. Teachers were always able to make their students and parents believe in them. Therefore, Yi Qian did not feel that there was anything wrong with Petty not telling the president about this. He could only say that Petty was not very vigilant. He opened his arms and hugged her gently. He smiled and said, "It's all right, Miss Petty. We'll be fine. Trust me. Now, I need to go up and take a look around." Before he could finish his sentence, he heard footsteps coming from outside. Yi Qian immediately let go of Petty and quickly picked up the rope that she had thrown on the ground. He wrapped his hands around it and tied them together. Chapter 494. Miss Petty, I untied myself just now. Please trust me. I'll protect you. As he tied himself up, he reminded Petty, who was still in a daze, "We'll definitely leave. We won't stay here any longer." Petty, who was still in a state of panic, finally came back to her senses after hearing Yi Qian's reminder. Her eyes flashed with surprise, but before she could say anything, the door opened with a bang. Two Al-Qaeda members walked in with guns in their hands. Then, the lights came on. Yi Qian, who was sitting facing the door, saw the two armed Al-Qaeda members walk up to them, followed by Pavel. She looked at Yi Qian for about a minute before saying, "Please forgive our rudeness, my friend from China. Even though we welcome you here, I had no choice but to bring you here. Trust me, if the government is willing to cooperate with us, your life won't be in any danger." Pavel didn't mention Petty because she was the most important hostage in Pavel's hands. Kidnapping Yi Qian was just another bargaining chip. The gray robes were probably the uniform of the Al-Qaeda members. When Yi Qian was taken out of the room again, he noticed that the men all wore the same gray robes, while the women wore the same black veil that Pavel wore. This is an orphanage. Why? Mr. Pavel, why did you bring us here? There are children here. Do you know that? There are children here. Petty became very agitated. She recognized where they were. This was an orphanage. The people who lived here were all orphans who had lost their families in the war. Do you want these orphans, who finally have a home, to be in danger again? Mr. Pavel, you can't do this. She was agitated because she was worried that Pavel would kidnap the orphans again. She spoke in English, so Yi Qian heard her clearly. It wasn't what Pavel thought, but it was what she did. Pavel, who was walking in front, turned around and stared at Petty with his big, black eyes under the veil. If it weren't for Mr. President, there wouldn't be any orphans here. They wouldn't have lost their families. So, Miss Petty, the person you need to blame is your father. The entire orphanage was under the control of the Al-Qaeda members. The staff were locked up in one room, and all the children were locked up in another room. Yi Qian and Patty were taken to the room where the children were kept. It was a room filled with the smell of gasoline. Yi Qian's gaze fell on a few oil drums filled with gasoline. His gaze narrowed slightly. Miss Petty, you'd better stay here obediently and tell the children that you're the one who saved them. If you want to save them, you'd better cooperate with me. Otherwise. Pavel picked up one of the barrels and took out a steel lighter. Otherwise, I'll set this barrel on fire and send all the children to heaven with you. The oldest child here was 12 years old, and the youngest child was 4 or 5 years old. This was a group of children who had seen war. They were especially sensitive to these things, and they were so scared that they started crying. Petty had never encountered something like this. Although she lived in a war-torn country, she was the president's daughter. She had always been protected. Right now, she was so frightened by Pavel's threat that her eyes filled with tears. Please tell me what I need to do. But please don't hurt them. Thank you. Even though she was scared, at least she was using her own actions to protect these children. Yi Qian was also completely ignored by Pavel. This made it easier for Yi Qian to do what he wanted. Chapter 495. At 5:37 p.m., G3 and K7 arrived at the school. Everything was normal in the school. The accompanying Pakistani soldier asked the teacher for a glass of water and snuck into the teacher's office with the excuse that she was thirsty. Pavel doesn't go home immediately after school. Instead, she goes to the temple to pray and enters the bunker building. The soldier entered the teacher's office and saw Pavel's photo. She expressed her gratitude as a student's father. This was the most important clue the soldier managed to find out in a short 5-minute conversation. Pavel was a believer, so it was normal for her to go to the temple. However, she avoided her colleagues' invitations every time. Even the teacher who saw her at the temple found her by accident. This meant that her whereabouts were not normal. G3, who was hiding in the dark, used a satellite phone to contact Xia Jinyuan, who was in the presidential palace, and told him all the clues they had found. Q King. Pavel is a member of Al-Qaeda. She's a teacher. There's an orphanage less than 5 kilometers away from the temple. It's full of children. You mean Pavel will bring Yi Qian to the orphanage? Xia Jinyuan was with the Pakistani president, so the president could understand the conversation in English. When he mentioned the orphanage, the president immediately bent over and looked at the map carefully. There was indeed an orphanage southwest of the temple that took in post-war children. Al-Qaeda was a military organization. No matter how powerful Xia Jinyuan was, he couldn't immediately find out where Pavel was. He needed to investigate carefully and figure out the exact location. Q King nodded. His imposing figure was like a rock in the Gobi Desert. He had a majestic aura that came from ancient times. K7 is already there. He'll report immediately if anything happens. The Pakistani government had just completed the handover of the old government, and the country was a relatively chaotic one. The fact that Al-Qaeda was so rampant could only mean that the other party was indeed powerful. Although the Pakistani government had invested a lot of military power to fight terrorism and extremism every year, there were still some things that they couldn't take into account. Pavel's incident showed the strength and weakness of a country. In China, such a situation didn't exist, let alone dangerous people rushing into the presidential palace. Yi Qian, who had been ignored the moment he entered the orphanage, used the corner of his eye to check the situation inside the room. After he was done, he lowered his head even more obediently. There was a telephone line in the room, but it had been torn. A yellow landline had fallen to the ground, and even the core inside had fallen out. He had to fix it first before he could use the communication device to contact Captain Xia. It would take more time, and this method would not work. It was even more impossible for her to escape alone. If she could escape, she could have done so at the presidential palace. He was in charge of the leader's personal safety, but he chose to leave Petty alone. He didn't need others to look down on him, he could even look down on himself. There was only one way, and it was also the most reliable way. Get Pavel to contact the presidential palace. He believed that with Captain Xia and the others' abilities, they would be able to find out their exact location with just a call. No matter how weak Pakistan was, it was still a country. They definitely had some small tracking technology. Then, he needed to think of a way to get the other party to contact the presidential palace. As Yi Qian listened to the conversation between Patty and Pavel, his only hope was to find out what they were up to. Chapter 496. What a good child. If your father is as open-minded and kind as you should continue your lesson today and return to your beautiful room to drink afternoon tea and spend a leisurely afternoon with your Chinese friends. Pavel did have a request. She needed to rescue an Al-Qaeda leader who had been captured by the government forces a week ago. If this person did not have an important position in Al-Qaeda, Pavel would not have exposed her identity. Yi Qian could tell that Pavel did have a request. Otherwise, she would not have said that Petty could go back after class. From her words, it was obvious that Pavel would continue to hide in the presidential palace as an English teacher if she did not need to kidnap Petty. Petty, ask her what she needs you for. Find a way to get her to contact the presidential palace. Yi Qian lowered his voice and said softly, we need to let the presidential palace know that we're safe. At times like this, Petty regarded Yi Qian as her spiritual support. Despite her fear, she still asked in a trembling voice, Teacher Pavel, what do you need me to do? If I can do it, I'll definitely do it for you. After all, you're my teacher. You're my most respected and beloved teacher. The president's daughter could not be that stupid. At the same time, Petty was using her own method to lower the vigilance of the Al-Qaeda members. Everyone knew that the president's eldest daughter had died in the hands of terrorists, so he protected his younger daughter very well. Some people even said that Petty thought that her country was a country free from war. Why would there be such rumors? Naturally, the president and his wife had to do something to make more people believe that Miss Petty was a simple, naive, and ignorant lady. Even the dangerous people lurking in the dark believed that Miss Petty was a simple, naive, and ignorant lady. A naive person would always lower the vigilance of others. At 5:52 in the evening, the president's informant received a call. 5 seconds later, he quickly cut into the presidential palace's office. The Pakistani president had just finished a call with the Chinese leader and learned that the Chinese side would fully support the Pakistani military's operation. The friendship between the two countries had always been deep. It was all because when the whole world had given up on Pakistan, China had extended a helping hand to help Pakistan through the difficulties. Until now, as long as a Chinese person visited Pakistan, they would be warmly welcomed. China is Pakistan's staunch ally. This was a phrase written in Pakistan's primary school textbooks to express the friendship between the two countries. The education they received since they were young was about the friendship between the two countries. Even their family education was the same. When Yi Qian, a Chinese student who was visiting Pakistan, was kidnapped, the Chinese side was not angry. Instead, they supported him unconditionally. This was undoubtedly what touched Pakistan the most. Therefore, the first thing the president asked when he received the call was, "How is my daughter, Petty?" He did not mention Yi Qian because he wanted the other party to think that Yi Qian was not important. He only wanted his daughter to be safe. A chess piece that could not play a significant role would always be easily discarded. Pavel made his demands over the phone. First, a large transport plane. Second, sufficient foreign exchange. Third, Chady Voryov had to be on the plane. Chady Voryov was the Al-Qaeda member captured by the government forces a week ago. Chapter 497. Mr. President, if even one of the 3 conditions that I mentioned is not met, then not only your daughter, but many other children will be burned to ashes by gasoline and will go to heaven with your daughter. As long as you are willing, we will do it immediately. Pavel had never thought that Petty would be the only one to make her request. She was confident that her request would be met if she gathered all the children in the orphanage. Only Petty and Yi Qian needed to know the exact location to rescue them, but with almost 50 children, the problem was much more serious. K7 was hiding in a high place where he could observe the movements of the orphanage. As he observed with binoculars, he said, "We have a lot of people and enough weapons. Consider fulfilling the request. At the same time, I suggest that we release some of the hostages. The transport plane can't fit dozens of children. It will be troublesome if there are too many children." He was a doctor, so his words were concise and straightforward, but every sentence was on point. Soon, the entire operation plan was revised. The president immediately called for an emergency response meeting and ordered the elite personnel from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and other relevant departments to quickly form a rescue command center. This was the largest group of children kidnapped in Pakistan. Even if these children were orphans and had no family to worry about them, no family was waiting for them to return safely. But to Pakistan, these were children that had to be rescued. They could not give up on them. Night began to fall. The Chinese side also participated in this operation. They suggested that they could not take all of them by force because other than Yi Qian and Petty, who were slightly older, the rest were young and ignorant children. Time passed slowly. Many children who were tired from crying were already tired. Only the older children knew the danger and kept their eyes open, not daring to close them. Yi Qian had already woken up from a nap. No matter what, it was important to be energetic. He had slept for about 2 hours, which meant that it was about 8 o'clock at night. It had been 2 hours since Petty had spoken to the president personally. At this time, Captain Xia and the others should be approaching the orphanage. Just as he thought about this, Yi Qian heard the chirping of birds. This was the most commonly heard chirping of birds in Pakistan. It was a type of lark. No one could tell what was wrong with the chirping of the birds, but Yi Qian, whose eyes were cold, knew that Captain Xia and the others were coming. Now that 2 people had come, he needed to confirm her exact location. The sound of a skylark could be heard, and then gradually disappeared. It was as if a naughty skylark that had stopped by the window frame outside the room had finally returned to its nest. 9 o'clock. Hostage confirmed 52. Hand over your weapon. The 2 Snowfield Brigade members outside perked up and quickly approached the 9 o'clock position. Inside the room, Yi Qian gently covered Petty's mouth and said softly, "Our people are here. Miss Petty, you just sit there quietly. Trust me, everyone will leave soon." After Petty nodded repeatedly, Yi Qian gently let go of her mouth. "Don't disturb the other children. Their cries will attract attention. I need to walk around now. No matter what happens, I can't scream, okay?" "Alright, I have no problem with that. Also, if you can give me a gun, I think I can also protect these children." Petty was not a naive girl. On the contrary, she was also a girl who knew how to use a gun. Chapter 498. Her words made Yi Qian smile. "Okay, I will try my best." He would try his best, but not now. After all, Petty had not undergone professional training. Once they found out that she had a gun, the consequences would be unimaginable. He patted Petty's shoulder gently and said, "Sit here and rest. If the children cry, try to comfort them. Trust me. Miss Petty, we will definitely leave this place safely. We will also bring all the children away safely." Yi Qian's words made Petty feel calm, because there was someone like her who was trying to protect the children. She had to muster up the courage to stand up and protect her own people. "Jane, don't worry. Although I don't have a gun, I have been learning from the guards, and I know a little about fighting." Petty lowered her head, and her voice was full of self-blame. "I am very, very sorry. I am very bad at fighting." Outside, two ghost-like figures snuck into the orphanage and found Yi Qian's room. Just as Yi Qian approached the door of the room where he was locked up, he heard a muffled sound in less than 2 minutes. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Yi Qian knew that the 2 Al-Qaeda members guarding the door had been taken care of. "Q King, Zhuangzi has taken care of it." Someone lowered his voice and transmitted an assassination message through the earpiece. On the other side, Xia Jinyuan, who was like a cheetah, snuck under a bus and stabbed a pushpin directly into the tire. He heard his comrade's voice through the earpiece and smiled. "Everything is going well. Inform Yi Qian to prepare for an attack from the inside." The Snowfield Brigade's entry meant that the entire rescue operation had begun. As for Pavel's 3 requests, the Pakistani president would fulfill them as soon as possible. The first thing to be done as soon as possible was to get Seti Vorakov out of prison. At the same time, the Chinese soldiers snuck into the orphanage. At this time, Pavel confirmed that Seti Vorakov had been released from prison and was on his way to Jiyang. It was also the time when the 2 Snowfield Brigade members successfully snuck into Yi Qian's room. Everything was done in perfect synchronicity. There was no difference in timing. The members of the Shuayu team who came to meet Yi Jian were not Xia Jinyuan and the other 3, but 2 members who could speak Urdu. They knew that one of the girls was the leader of the protection team. She was also the representative of the students from the 2 countries for the exchange. Yi Jian kept hearing soft knocking sounds coming from outside. She tapped her fingers on the door a few times in response. After getting confirmation again, she said softly, "We can't fight. There are a few barrels of gasoline in the room, and the 4 children are covered in gasoline. If we fight, it will cause an explosion. There are a total of 32 hostages. 16 of them are under the age of 6, and the oldest is 12. After the war, many children were not very tall due to long-term malnutrition. A 12-year-old boy looked like a 10-year-old boy." Listening to her detailed report, the 2 members of the Shuayu team, who had changed into gray robes and camouflaged themselves, quickly exchanged glances. From her voice, they knew that she was the person they were looking for, Yi Jian, who had helped King Q and the others complete their missions many times. He was very calm and did not have a trace of fear. "Roger that. The president has agreed to their request. A batch of hostages will be released at 10:00 today." A completely unfamiliar voice came through the wooden door. "I am V8, and the other member is T6. We have entered the base and camouflaged ourselves." Chapter 499. Yi Qian immediately felt a lot more at ease. As expected of the Chinese Special Forces, their actions were swift and decisive. They directly killed their way into the base, disguised themselves as the enemy, and then coordinated with their comrades outside. The lock from the inside started to click. After a click, the tightly shut door was gently pushed open. "Keep the gun you left behind, my little comrade." V8 smiled and quickly passed the gun through the gap. He quickly closed the door again. 15 bullets, no reloaded magazines. "It's good to have a gun." Yi Qian, who had picked up the gun, pursed his lips and smiled. Before he could speak, he heard V8 say in a deep voice, "Yi Qian, in the first batch of hostages released at 10:00 tonight, you weren't there. You weren't there in the second batch either. You were still in the hands of the Al-Qaeda operatives when you boarded the plane. Are you scared?" This was an arrangement that couldn't be changed because Yi Qian was originally here to protect the leader. Now, he had become the protector of Petty. A soldier's duty was to go wherever they were needed. Yi Qian, even if she wasn't in uniform, in many people's hearts, she was a soldier. A soldier had to fight to the end. Everyone could leave, but a soldier couldn't. Outside the door, V8 and T6 expressions were a little solemn. In their hearts, they also felt that it was a little cruel to treat a 16 or 17-year-old girl like this. However, Q King took the initiative to suggest to the leader that Yi Qian stay until the end to protect Petty. The leader hesitated for a moment, but in the end, he nodded in agreement. In the face of the country's interests, Yi Qian could only choose to stay by Petty's side until the end. Your arrangement is the best arrangement in my heart. I need to protect Petty. This is my duty. And I will do my best to protect Miss Petty and bring her back to the President and Madam President's side. Yi Qian didn't feel sad at all. He even felt that this was the best arrangement. From his tone and words, he could tell that he absolutely obeyed the arrangement without any objections. Because he had already learned to obey. When the two Snowfield Brigade members heard this, a hint of surprise flashed across their calm eyes. He accepted it just like that. Without any questions. Not even a single objection. Don't worry, you're definitely not fighting alone, and you're definitely not alone on the plane with Petty. The T6 combatant wanted to comfort Yi Qian and make her feel more at ease. He also wanted to tell her that no matter what, comrades would never give up on each other. Yi Qian was about to walk back to Petty's side when he heard this. He chuckled softly, and his low voice was filled with joy. I know. Someone has to fly the transport plane. Since I'm on the plane, there must be soldiers from our country on the plane. Also, there should be some distance between the orphanage and the airport. If we want to leave, we have to drive, and we can only take a bus. I guess there must be our soldiers hiding in the bus. Her voice was like the soft chirping of insects in the summer night. Although it was soft, every word was clear. Her deduction made V8 and T6 raise their eyebrows. If I'm not wrong, our leader and Mr. President should have discussed it and decided not to give Pavel the chance to walk out of the orphanage. It's better to finish him off inside. Yi Qian, who was holding a gun, leaned against the wooden door with the paint peeling off. His voice was as gentle as the evening breeze as he said, "Moreover, I believe that my country won't give up on me. I also know that my country will never allow the Al-Qaeda terrorists to continue running rampant." Chapter 500. Yi Qian had never thought about the consequences of being one of the last people left in the hands of the Al-Qaeda terrorists. She believed that with that tall and sturdy man outside, he would not give up on her. She also believed that if he was not here now, he must be waiting for her on the transport plane. That was because he would not let her face this alone. Yi Qian trusted Xia Jinyuan so much. Just like Xia Jinyuan, who had also sneaked into the orphanage, he also believed that Yi Qian would be fine. The two comrades outside laughed silently. This young lady really had the aura of a soldier. The transport plane has already been arranged. It's quite a distance from the orphanage to the airport. There are several rescue plans. If everything goes well, we can deal with it in the orphanage. The T6 soldier was a top soldier who had been selected from the military and had rich combat experience. When he saw how calm Yi Qian was, he smiled deeply. So, your guess is exactly right. We're indeed planning to deal with it in the orphanage. This was the best outcome. However, Al-Qaeda was also a militarized organization. Everyone believed that this matter would not be so simple and that Pavel would definitely have a backup plan. But now that there are gasoline barrels in the room, it'll be a little more difficult. Yi Qian pursed his lips slightly. His gaze swept across several gasoline barrels, as well as a few children who were curled up in the corner with gasoline spilled all over them. He then gently shifted his gaze to the top of the wall. He slowly recalled what he saw when he entered the room earlier. When his mind finally settled on a certain memory, a light flashed past his dark eyes. I have an idea, get back to your positions. V8, who was in charge of security, reminded them in a low voice. The two people inside and outside the door quickly got back to their positions. In less than 2 minutes, several footsteps passed by outside and quickly left. Yi Qian quickly said to Petty, they've already left. Tell me that everything is fine outside. The president has agreed to all of Pavel's requests, and everything is ready. Petty, we just need to wait for the rescue. He did not tell Petty that the people standing outside were actually Chinese soldiers. It was not that he was worried about Petty, but the fewer people who knew, the better. On the other side, Pavel waited for the government's final call. She needed to confirm whether Chady Vorikov had arrived at the airport and whether he had seen the transport plane. Dressed in black, she looked like a venomous spider. Every word she spoke was laced with venom. Leave the first batch of hostages in the room. Pour all the gasoline in the room. If an accident happens on our way to the airport, burn them all to death. Let the entire country see how incompetent their president is. Instead of releasing half of the hostages were left in the orphanage. If anything happened on the way to the airport, then the children and the staff of the orphanage would be burned alive. There were about 60 Al-Qaeda members in the orphanage, and 15 of them stayed by Pavel's side. All of them obeyed her every command like soldiers. While Pavel waited for Chady Vorikov's call, Petty carried a sleeping child and ordered the older children to carry the other children away from Yi Qian. Listen, my friend. None of us can make a sound. Cover our mouths because we need a lot of water. Only with water can we avoid being burned to death. Do you understand? As they spoke, Yi Jian and Yi Jian used the silver wire on their wrists to wrap around the water pipe. Then, they used a broken wooden leg of the table to twist the silver wire. As the silver wire wrapped tighter and tighter, water started to seep out of the water pipe. Chapter 501. The water flowed gently, and all the children held their breaths. They were afraid that the sound of the water would suddenly become louder and alert the Al-Qaeda operatives guarding them outside. The 5 children who had been drenched in gasoline covered their mouths. Their big, bright eyes were filled with surprise as they allowed the cool water to wash their bodies. The thick layer of gasoline that they were afraid of seemed to lessen as they wiped their clothes clean. Yi Qian leaned against the door again and knocked on it rhythmically with his hand. After getting a response, he said in a low voice, I suggest we adopt the second course of action. Leave the orphanage and take care of them on the plane. You're going to pour the gasoline out. V8 raised his eyebrows slightly. He immediately guessed why Yi Qian suggested the second course of action. He lowered his voice to the lowest and asked, we don't have much time. We need to fulfill all of Pavel's requests before 10 o'clock. It's been almost 3 hours since our last call. Yi Qian, we don't have much time left. With a smile on his face, Yi Qian felt that it was indeed very easy to have a comrade like him on the outside. They could guess what he wanted to do. I'll dispose of all the gasoline and turn this dangerous house into the safest room. This way, we won't have to worry about bullets accidentally hitting gasoline barrels during gunfire and causing an explosion. My second suggestion is to release the first batch of hostages before Pavel leaves in the car. Before Yi Qian could say the word release, the T6 soldier in charge of security knocked on the door lightly with his gun. He did not say anything and nimbly returned to the children's side. Petty immediately reminded all the children in Urdu, someone's coming. This group of children had survived the flames of war and were very sensitive to danger. Petty's reminder made all of them immediately lower their heads and hug their knees as if they were fast asleep. The 5 children who had been drenched in gasoline all squatted in a corner. Yi Qian gently put the hose back on, and everything returned to normal. The door was not opened. The patrolling soldiers just came over to check if there was anything unusual as usual. When they found that there was no movement, they gave a few instructions and left. Case 7, there are 3 patrolling soldiers coming. Be careful. V8 maintained contact with Case 7 and informed him of the situation on his side so that Case 7, who was in the middle of a mission, and his comrades who were coming to support him, could be prepared. Case 7, who had already found the orphanage staff that was locked up, whispered to the other figures, "Hide." Before the patrolling Al-Qaeda members came over, they were like owls that appeared at night. In the blink of an eye, they hid. The entire orphanage was no longer under Pavel's control. As the Chinese soldiers infiltrated the orphanage, at the very least, the Al-Qaeda members guarding the orphanage would be replaced by disguised Chinese soldiers. Yi Qian did not know exactly how many hostages were being held. When she heard the footsteps moving away, she quickly washed the other 2 children who had not yet washed off the gasoline. Right now, we're only removing the smell of gasoline from their bodies. The danger hasn't been resolved yet. We have to move the gasoline barrels away. Yi Qian whispered to Petty, whose joy could be felt even in the dark. He said softly, "Bullets will still explode when they hit the gasoline barrels. The best way is to get the gasoline out of the barrels away from us." Leaving this place was not an easy task. When Petty, who finally had a smile on her face, heard what Yi Qian said, sadness crept into her eyes again. "Then what should we do? The barrels are too big. How are we going to move them out?" Chapter 502. Yi Qian blinked. His dark eyes were like the crescent moon in the treetops, cold and confident. If there's a water pipe, there's also a sewer pipe. Just pour the gasoline into the sewer pipe, and there's no need to worry. This used to be a master bedroom. After some renovations, the bathroom in the master bedroom was removed, and after some simple renovations, it became a gathering place for the children of the orphanage. Otherwise, Pavel would not have kidnapped all the children at once. The refurbished wooden floor was pried open bit by bit using a nail that was unscrewed from the foot of a table. The creaking sound was like a mouse grinding against a wooden table, coming and going from time to time. The T6 and V8 combatants who were on guard outside listened carefully to the sounds inside. Once all the gasoline was poured out, the room that was originally the most dangerous would become the safest room. Then, the operation plan would be changed to Plan B. They would no longer use the orphanage as the main battlefield, but move to the airport instead. Yi Qian's suggestion was quickly conveyed by V8 to J5, a member of the Snowfield Brigade who was guarding outside. He was responsible for contacting the Chinese interpreter at the presidential palace, and then relaying the message to the presidential palace and the Chinese leaders. The atmosphere was getting tenser and tenser. The elite personnel who participated in the rescue operation in the presidential palace were worried about the gasoline barrels. However, the news from the Chinese interpreter instantly saved them. "Thank you very much for the bravery of the Chinese student. Her action will change the fate of 32 children and save them from the clutches of death." After learning that the Chinese girl who was kidnapped along with his daughter Petty was trying to get rid of the gasoline, the president said to the members involved in the rescue operation, "No matter what the outcome is, we have to thank this Chinese girl for her bravery. We have to always remember that the Chinese are our eternal brothers, our true brothers." This was the best news they had received in the 6 hours since the kidnapping. It was a piece of news that lifted everyone's spirits. Qin Xiu looked at the Pakistani elite personnel who all looked relieved. There was not much of a smile on his handsome face, but the pen in his hand was gently clenched. As a Chinese, he also did not want to see the students from his country in danger. Besides, he knew Yi Qian. If they had chosen to act under the noses of Al-Qaeda and were discovered, the consequences would have been unimaginable. However, it was clear that this decision had received everyone's approval. It was a gamble, to seek victory in the midst of danger. After the leader who had not slept in the hotel found out, he was silent for a long time before he said, "The young are strong, and the country is strong." Student Little Yi represents the strength of the young, and also let us see the hope of a country. She did very well. So, you agree with the second action plan of China-Pakistan? The Major General looked at the leader with a serious expression and asked softly. Then, in the end, it was Yi Qian who boarded the transport plane with the Al-Qaeda organization. Waving his hand, the leader replied in a solemn voice, "We won't give them the chance to board the plane and leave. We'll settle it on the plane. Tell all the Chinese soldiers that they must rescue our students safely." Yi Qian had to be rescued safely. This was the top priority of the entire Chinese military operation team. In the darkness, the Snowfield Brigade K7 and another anti-terrorism special force had rushed over and assassinated several members of the Al-Qaeda organization. They had successfully disguised themselves and were waiting for the best opportunity to strike. Chapter 503. There are 20 hostages in total. Team C has been deployed. K7's cold voice came from the headset without warning. Team B consisted of V8 and the others, while Team C consisted of K7. The members of both teams had successfully disguised themselves as members of Al-Qaeda and taken over the task of guarding the hostages. Now, they were all waiting for Yi Qian's news. As long as the gasoline barrels were no longer a threat, the second set of operations could be carried out smoothly and the first batch of hostages would be safe. Team A has been deployed. How's Team B doing? Xia Jinyuan, who was in charge of Team A, asked softly through the headset. He and G3 were already hiding in the luggage compartment of the bus, waiting for the Pakistani government troops to be deployed. They would act as backup and eliminate all the Al-Qaeda members together. V8 put on the headset and leaned close to the door. After listening for a few seconds, he replied to Xia Jinyuan, "There's no reply yet. I heard very soft sounds in the room. Yi Qian is very cautious, so he might be a little slow." Xia Jinyuan laughed, but it was not a laugh. He just curved his thin, sexy lips. Then, they would have to wait a little longer. Little Fox would find a way. "Give me these 3 milk bottles." As the last barrel of gasoline was about to be emptied, Yi Qian gestured for Petty to give him the milk bottles that the children had drunk. After filling the barrel with water, pour the gasoline from the milk bottles on the edge to prevent the smell of gasoline from fading when they come in. The 3 milk bottles were filled with gasoline. Yi Qian carefully twisted them and gestured for Petty to continue pouring the rest of the gasoline into the sewer. He then gently touched the barrel that was still filled with water. "This is fine. Change to the next one." Just in case, Yi Qian poured the gasoline out and refilled the empty barrel with water to ensure that the weight was the same. Yi Qian was professionally trained to ensure that not a single trace of oil was left out. After the barrel was filled with water, he poured the gasoline from the milk bottles on the edge of the barrel. As expected, the air was filled with the strong smell of gasoline from before. Time passed very slowly, and the hour hand pointed to 10 o'clock. It was getting closer and closer to the time Pavel had requested. Both China and Pakistan were fully deployed, and all the soldiers in the operation were on standby. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the entire city of Pakistan was not as brightly lit as the cities in China. Some people were partying until they were drunk. In this place, it was best to hurry home after dark. Don't linger outside and be careful of being killed. At 9:50 a.m., Pavel finally received a call from Chady Vorakov. He was calling from the airport, laughing as he told the woman who had rescued him that the transport plane had arrived at the airport. According to the agreement, the first batch of hostages was successfully released. The 20 workers of the orphanage were released. To Pavel, adults were not easy to control. Keeping them alive would be a problem. Chase all of them out of the orphanage. I want to see if the government troops are coming. Like a venomous spider, Pavel carefully used the hostages she had released to probe the situation outside. She would immediately fire a warning shot as soon as she detected any reinforcements from the government. At 10:00 sharp, the first batch of hostages successfully left the room. All of them were driven out of the orphanage by the Al-Qaeda members. The hostages frantically ran out of the orphanage as fast as they could. It was very quiet outside. Other than the hostages' cries, there were no government troops. A few Al-Qaeda members who were standing guard at a high point reported what they had seen to the cunning Pavel. It's very quiet. I don't see any government troops. Madam, it seems that they didn't send troops to surround the orphanage. Chapter 504. Very well. Tell the president that I will release the second batch of hostages after arriving at the airport. Release the last batch of hostages before boarding the plane. Only Miss Petty and the Chinese student will remain. Pavel didn't lower her guard. She continued to use the hostages as a bargaining chip to ensure her safety. She once again stated her conditions. The president, who was already waiting at the airport, still had only one condition. She had to fulfill all of her demands, but she had to release the hostages. This made Pavel even more aware of the importance of the hostages. The Chinese translator was Qin Xiu. His voice was transmitted through the cold communication device to the headsets of the Chinese soldiers who were connected by radio waves. Pavel requested that the second batch of hostages remain in the room. To ensure the safety of the hostages, the president told Pavel that he only has one condition: release all of the hostages. Qin Xiu, who was in charge of translation, translated the president's words one by one. The leader proposed to the presidential palace that the Chinese operation team cooperate with the Pakistani government forces to complete the task. They must finish before the transport plane takes off. Qin Xiu's voice was very calm. At this time, he occasionally raised his eyes to look at the transport plane that was already parked on the runway. About an hour later, the last batch of hostages would arrive at the airport, but it was impossible to release Yi Qian. Taking a deep breath, Qin Xiu, who was resting, put one hand in his pocket. His elegant and handsome face showed a bit of coldness. At 10:11 a.m., Pavel verbally agreed to the president's request, but before she got into the car, she ordered the remaining Al-Qaeda members, follow the original plan. When you leave, explode the gasoline barrels. Don't let anyone escape. She didn't intend to let the children in the orphanage go. These children had all seen the faces of the Al-Qaeda members. If they were captured, she would still be punished when she returned. The remaining members couldn't leave alive. They had no other choice but to die here. They were willing to stay and sacrifice their lives for their organization. The door of the room where the children were held opened again. After a strong flash of light, Yi Qian saw two men in gray robes walk in. Hide the gun and give me your hands. Quick. It was V8 and T6, two members of the Snowfield Brigade. In order to prevent Yi Qian's gun from being discovered, they came in first and pushed Yi Qian and Petty out. The next time Yi Qian saw Pavel was on the bus. Pavel and Patty's hands were tied again and they were pushed onto the bus at gunpoint. Let the two of them sit in the two seats at the front. Pavel, who had been sitting in the car for a long time, ordered coldly, look carefully. The two of them are our bargaining chips to leave this place. Without them, all of us will die with Chedovorikov. Patty stopped talking to Pavel. All the children in the car were sitting close to the window. Beside them was an Al-Qaeda member who was holding a gun and had loaded his gun. If there was any movement outside, all the hostages would be killed. The car bumped along the road. When the man standing beside Yi Qian made a sharp turn, he grabbed her arm with both hands and gently drew the letter V with his fingers. It was V8 in disguise. Yi Qian thought they had stayed in the orphanage. She didn't expect them to be right next to her. Then, Yi Qian found out from V8 that there were a total of 4 members of the Snowfield Brigade on the bus. One of them was Xia Jinyuan. Chapter 505. G3, V8, T6, K7, as well as Captain Xia, there were 5 Special Forces soldiers in one car. Once all the hostages were released, it would be time to deal with these guys. The only thing Yi Qian did not have to worry about after falling into the hands of this group of believers was whether or not he would be violated. He simply leaned against the seat and closed his eyes to rest. With his own people around, he felt much more relaxed. Since there was nothing else to do now, he might as well rest. When the car passed by a section with streetlights, T6 saw Yi Qian closing his eyes and looking like he was fast asleep. Was he relaxed? Or was he stupid? Or was he really that calm? The car arrived at the airport at 11:02 p.m. The third leader of Al-Qaeda, Seti Vorakov, had been waiting for a long time. When he saw Pavel get out of the car in a black veil, he gave her a warm hug. "Thank you very much, my partner." A loudspeaker sounded, followed by the president's voice. "Miss Pavel, we have prepared everything according to your request. The last batch of hostages will be released immediately." "Of course, Mr. President." It was Seti Vorakov's voice. It was a fierce and arrogant baritone. "However, your daughter and the girl from China will have to accompany us on a wonderful escape in the air." "Of course, sir, I promise not to hurt your daughter or your friends." Listening to the other party's arrogant voice, the Pakistani president remained calm and said calmly, "We will definitely let you go. However, if anything happens to my daughter, believe me, Seti Vorakov, even if you are flying in the air, I can still send out a fighter jet to turn you into ashes in the sky. Believe me, I will definitely do it." This warning really shocked the arrogant Seti Vorakov. If the fighter jet was really sent out, they really had no way to escape. However, Pavel laughed. When the woman's voice was gentle, it was pleasant to the ear, but when she was ruthless, it was sharp, ear-piercing, gloomy, and unpleasant. "Mr. President, if we don't leave safely, all the children in the orphanage will be burned to death. So, we have to deal with this calmly and settle this matter peacefully." The Pakistani president was deliberately stalling for time. He needed to buy time for the Chinese troops who had sneaked onto the transport plane. "Very well, we also hope that this can be resolved peacefully," Seti Vorakov said viciously as he gestured for the few Al-Qaeda members to get out of the car. He was even more cunning than Pavel. He didn't release the hostages immediately. Instead, he had people push Yi Qian and Patty to the front to prevent himself and Pavel from being killed. V8 was standing in front of the bus, K7 was standing on both sides of the door, and T6 was standing on the side where the luggage door was opened. During the negotiation, Yi Qian and Petty were pushed off the bus, while Xia Jinyuan and G3 quietly came out of the luggage compartment under the cover of T6. Each of them was responsible for one target. While the T6 combatants were on alert, each of them covered the mouth of an Al-Qaeda member and slit his neck with the dagger in his hand. Before blood spurted out, they stuffed the eliminated target back into the vehicle. The two of them replaced the 2 Al-Qaeda members and successfully infiltrated the plane. While the Chinese soldiers were eliminating the targets, Pavel sent people to search the transport plane inside and out. Fearing that there would be an ambush, she even searched the 8 crew members on the plane. After confirming that they weren't carrying any weapons, she boarded the plane. Chapter 506. The children all became bulletproof human shields for the Al-Qaeda members. They waited until they boarded the plane before pushing them off. Some of the children fell directly from the lift. No matter how painful the fall was, they didn't dare to cry out loud. These children were slightly older, so they more or less had the ability to make judgments. They didn't dare to cry or move. The 20 or so children were all huddled together. The panic in their eyes was something that Yi Qian would never forget for the rest of her life. When an Al-Qaeda member walked past her with his head down, Yi Qian smelled a faint mint scent. This is. She, who had been keeping her head down, looked up slightly. Under the faint indicator lights on the runway, she saw the side profile of a man so handsome that even his slightly pursed lips looked elegant. He seemed to know that she was looking at him. The corners of his mouth curved into a smile as he boarded the plane with a hostage and all the Al-Qaeda members. When she saw the G3 member walk past her, Yi Qian, who had her head down, had a faint smile in her eyes. Since they were all on the transport plane, K7 should be on it as well. After all the members boarded the plane, only Yi Qian and Petty were left. Step by step, they pushed each other onto the plane. Yi Qian looked back slightly at the children who were out of control. The scene she saw made her heart tremble violently. Those young faces did not have the innocence of a child, only the fear of an adult in the face of danger. Their eyes were not bright and beautiful, only gloomy, as if there was no life in them. They are safe. V8, who was escorting Yi Qian onto the plane, said softly, "Soon, it will be our battle. Yi Qian, I look forward to fighting alongside you." There weren't many Special Forces members in the Snowfield Brigade. They all knew each other and often went on missions together. Everyone in the brigade knew about Yi Qian and Xia Jinyuan. Now that there was an opportunity to meet Yi Qian, V8 didn't want to miss it. He wanted to see how powerful the girl who was recognized by the G3 was. Hearing the interest in his voice, Yi Qian raised her eyebrows. "I'm also looking forward to seeing the strong team up." It was only on the battlefield that he felt like he had found his life's goal. When he returned to the classroom, he felt less passionate about life. This time, she was also looking forward to fighting alongside them. "There's a total of 30 bullets here. There's enough ammunition, but it's not enough to turn the entire body into a sieve." When they reached the last step of the elevator, V8 stuffed another magazine into Yi Qian's pocket and a tiny Swiss Army dagger into Yi Qian's hand. "Try to cut the ropes with a knife. The plane will circle the runway for about 5 minutes. We'll start the operation in 5 minutes." The children were all left in the car. Only Yi Qian and Petty were brought onto the transport plane. Never in Pavel's wildest dreams would she have imagined that 5 Chinese special forces had infiltrated her team, and that 5 elite Pakistani government soldiers were among the crew members who were in charge of flying the plane. As the elevator of the transport plane closed, Yi Qian saw more than 20 Al-Qaeda members start to raise their guns and shout, "Be careful of the guns in your hands. What you need to do now is to put them away properly. Don't let the bullets damage our plane." Chady Vorikov laughed out loud. He had a very long beard, and his eyes were fierce. He swept his gaze across the entire cabin, and finally, his eyes fell on the Chinese girl sitting behind him, Yi Jian's face. After that, he laughed even louder. Chapter 507. You are a brave believer. Your husband will definitely forgive you, he said to Pavel. Everyone thought that Pavel was a brave and capable believer. They put down their guns and celebrated their successful escape. What they didn't know was that the few Al-Qaeda members who were still in the plane had their necks twisted by the Pakistani government's elite soldiers. Their heads were lying on the ground at strange angles. The plane rumbled as if it was about to leave the ground soon. Someone began to make a move silently, taking out the targets sitting next to them. All of them were directly dealt with through assassination. Amidst their celebration, there was not a trace of sound in the action. Yi Jian's hands were twisting. She used the Swiss Army knife handed over by the V8 to cut the knot. As the plane turned, she fell towards Petty. At the same time, the sharp army knife cut the rope around Petty's wrists. Prepare to take off. The cabin crew's voice sounded tense. It sounded like they were being controlled by the Al-Qaeda members. All the lights in the cabin went out. Yi Qian pushed Pavel away from him. Hide in the front. V8 was guarding the front, so Pavel was the safest. A gunshot rang out. The Al-Qaeda members who were laughing just now were stunned for a few seconds. Pavel's scream pierced through the cabin and woke everyone up. Ms. Pavel, you are too rude to a guest from afar. In our country, there is a saying that courtesy demands reciprocity. I wonder if you have heard of it. Yi Qian, who killed Seti Voriov with one shot, stood next to Pavel and wrapped the silver wire in his hand around her neck. It was the silver wire around Pavel's neck that made her scream in fear. When she pointed a gun at someone's head, she would never be afraid. Instead, she would be confident and awe-inspiring. However, when someone pointed a gun at her head, Pavel only had one thought in her mind: it's over. It's over. You are not a student. Pavel's neck tightened as if he was going to suffocate in the next second. Then, he softened his voice and said, I don't care if you're a Chinese student or not. Trust me, I have no reason to hurt you. We just want to leave this place and return to our hometown. Whether it was snakes or poisonous spiders, they would not give up the opportunity to counterattack until the last second. Just like snakes, even if their heads were chopped off, they would still have the ability to jump up and bite people. That was how Pavel was. He wouldn't give up a chance to escape until the very last second. Of course I'm a Chinese student. Otherwise, why would I be kidnapped by you? Yi Qian grabbed Powell's arm with one hand and twisted it. Powell's shrill scream came from the cabin again. Her arm was dislocated by Yi Qian, and she lost the ability to fight back. I will treat you the same way you treated me in the past. In our country, this is called reciprocity, Yi Qian said softly with a faint smile. His voice was light, but his actions were ruthless. He didn't give Pavel any chance to escape. He pinned her down on the seat and tied her legs tightly with the silver wire in his hand. The entire cabin was filled with the smell of blood. The members of the Shuayu Brigade, who were disguised as members of the Al-Qaeda organization, had already prepared for battle the moment their opponents put down their guns. Now, they had to either use their guns to finish off their targets or use their daggers to clean them up. Chapter 508. Yi Qian did not have to worry about Pavel escaping, so he joined the operation. He either plunged his Swiss Army dagger into Pavel's neck or finished him off with his gun. The crew members of the Bafang left behind on the transport plane were all dressed in military uniforms. The members of the Shuayu team did not have the strong body odor of the Bafang people. Whenever they encountered someone with a beard, Yi Jian would kill them without hesitation. The plane had already stopped operating, and the elite Pakistani government troops in the cabin quickly contacted the control tower. The Pakistani government troops hidden in the surroundings all came out, with bulletproof shields at the front and gunners at the back. As long as someone came down from the open door, they would immediately shoot. Miss Petty has been successfully rescued. The first message the control tower received was that the president's daughter, Petty, had been successfully rescued. The Pakistani soldiers guarding the control tower immediately looked happy. Qin Xiu's gaze fell on the communication device. He could even hear gunshots coming from it. There was a gunfight on the transport plane. He clenched his fists and contacted the leader to report the current situation. Miss Petty has been successfully rescued. There is no news from Yi Qian for now. Both sides have started a gunfight. This was good news for the Chinese side. Yi Qian had always been by Petty's side. Yi Qian must have been able to protect her. Keep me updated on the situation until Yi Qian returns safely. The leader's calm expression had not changed since Yi Qian was kidnapped. He was not anxious at all. He only had the calm demeanor of a country's leader. He believed that Yi Qian would return safely. He also believed that his country's soldiers would complete their mission successfully. Some of the members of the Al-Qaeda organization got their hands on submachine guns. Bang! 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 Bullets rained down on the cabin. At the same time, they shouted in Urdu, telling their people to get down. Yi Qian felt a burning pain in his arm. He reacted quickly and got down on the ground. He moved closer to the Al-Qaeda member with the machine gun. He was very close to Pavel. He could not let Pavel return to the Al-Qaeda member. "Don't move, little fox." A familiar voice came from beside her, and then she fell into an embrace that smelled of mint. This was Xia Jinyuan's embrace. It was gentle, generous, and so reassuring. After bringing Yi Qian to a safe place, Xia Jinyuan finally let go of him. "What were you trying to do just now? Accept the offer of the guy with the submachine gun. Are you going to sacrifice yourself as a hostage?" His voice was gentle when he greeted Yi Qian, but when he was calculating, his voice was cold and harsh. Obviously, he did not agree with Yi Qian's decision. Yi Qian wasn't affected by the close contact during the battle. After being reprimanded, Yi Qian said calmly, "No, I wouldn't do something stupid like that. He's too close to Pavel." Xia Jinyuan heaved a sigh of relief and chuckled. "Next time, I'll have to give you a microphone so that we can keep in touch. I was really scared when I saw you trying to crawl over just now. Captain Xia, am I really that stupid?" With their backs against each other, Yi Qian touched her arm gently. Fortunately, it was just a graze from a stray bullet. She only needed to take care of it. Chapter 509. She held her breath. Xia Jinyuan, who was leaning against her, said coldly, "Where are you hurt? Bandage it with a bandage to stop the bleeding." The biggest difference between a bullet wound and a graze wound was that the smell of blood was not as strong. Yi Qian lifted her arm and said casually, "It's just a graze wound. There's not much blood, just some skin scrapes. I'll bandage it after we get off the plane." She paused for a moment and said, "Captain Xia, I'll crawl over and hold Pavel hostage. Then you can tell the crew to turn on the cabin lights and shoot at the right time. The sooner we get this done, the better." As she spoke, K7's voice came from Xia Jinyuan's earpiece. It was the same as what Yi Qian had said. The sooner they got this done, the better. "Yi Qian will move first. Take Pavel to us as a hostage. You guys can rest for a while." Xia Jinyuan's voice clearly traveled to the Snowfield Brigade's earpiece. V8 turned his head and asked K7 softly, "I suspect that Yi Qian was the one who fired the first shot. What do you think? This is Q King's little fox. She's good at seizing opportunities. It's normal for her to shoot. She was the closest to Chady Vorikov. The person she shot was none other than the number one target, Chady Vorikov. So you don't have to doubt it, it's certain," K7 said coldly. His tone did not change, but he spoke a little longer than usual. V8, who was familiar with his personality, could tell that he admired Yi Qian. Now I'm even more interested. But I have to admit that she's very calm. V8, who was hiding in the back of the cabin, was even more curious about Yi Qian. Seeing was believing. He had to see for himself today. V8 and T6 soon realized what kind of girl Yi Qian was. She was a girl who dared to stand so close to the Al-Qaeda members. She was the only girl who had the courage to stand so close to them. The lights in the cabin were switched on. Only 6 of the original 20 Al-Qaeda members were left. They held submachine guns in their hands and wanted to fight back, but they heard a crisp female voice. Look at who I have in my hands. It won't be too late for you to fight back. Yi Qian spoke in Chinese, and V8 translated for the remaining 6 members of Al-Qaeda. Even Chady Vorikov is finished. How long do you think you can last? Yi Qian said this in English for Pavel to understand that going against the government would not end well. Pavel's face was contorted. Her mouth was stuffed with her veil, and she was making muffled sounds. Why were there government troops on the plane? They had clearly checked that there were no problems. Other than the flight crew, there was no one else on the plane. Pavel looked at the countless Al-Qaeda members in gray robes lying on the ground. Her eyes were bloodshot. Where did the accident happen? When the Al-Qaeda members who were surrounded saw this, their eyes flashed fiercely. They looked like they were going to fight Yi Qian to the death. One of them started cursing loudly in Urdu. Yi Qian pulled the black veil out of Pavel's mouth and let her speak. Kill me. Burn all the children in the orphanage. Pavel, who could finally speak, had a strange smile on her face. She could not turn her head and stare at Yi Qian, who was standing behind her. She looked gloomily at the back of the cabin. Soon, it will be reported internationally. The whole world will know how powerful we are and how incompetent the president is. Chapter 5:10. Why would I give you the chance to do that? By the time the bus leaves the orphanage, all your followers will have been dealt with. The children who were frightened by you might have already fallen asleep under the government's arrangements, Yi Qian said coldly. I won't give you a chance to escape, and I won't give you a chance to harm innocent lives, Yi Qian said coldly, her clear voice like frost, sending chills down Pavel's spine. No matter how fierce Pavel's gaze was, Yi Qian looked at the Al-Qaeda member with the submachine gun and said coldly, if you want to shoot, kill Pavel first. Then you can think about how to get rid of us. Kill them. Kill all of them. Pavel, whose neck had 2 red marks, screamed in a shrill voice. His voice could not be too loud as it was squeezed out from his throat. Xia Jinyuan, who was secretly preparing, turned sideways and aimed at the target with Yi Qian's movement. Bang! The Al-Qaeda member with the submachine gun was shot in the head. The bullet went through his entire head and fell to the ground with red and white blood. When Pavel heard someone say retreat in Chinese, he seemed to understand what was going on. He stared in disbelief at the member who had fallen to the ground. Chinese soldiers. There are Chinese soldiers here. It's too late for you to understand now. Pavel, there's no way you can escape from the hands of our soldiers. Yi Qian dragged Pavel back under the cover of Xia Jinyuan and the others. Next, it was time to clean up the mess. This matter was left to the Pakistani government. After all, it was a country's internal affairs. The Chinese soldiers had done their job well. The Pakistani soldiers had no intention of letting the Al-Qaeda members leave. After Xia Jinyuan opened fire, the 2 sides immediately engaged in a fierce battle. The Al-Qaeda members, who were at the end of their rope, could not escape from the hands of the Pakistani soldiers even if they had guns. The tail of the transport plane opened, and the Snowfield Brigade members who were fighting at the back quickly retreated. The Pakistani government soldiers, who were wearing masks, charged forward. "Put her on the plane. Someone will take care of her." Xia Jinyuan couldn't help but laugh when he saw that she was carrying Pavel, who had fainted after being shot. "He's a burden. He'll only delay our retreat. We can't leave this up there. We have to hand it over to the president to execute." Before the flare and smoke grenades were thrown into the cabin, Yi Qian finally left the transport plane and returned to the ground. Standing beside her was Xia Jinyuan, who had protected her during the retreat. He was dressed in a gray robe. From the back, he looked like a Pakistani man. Gunshots kept coming from the cabin behind them. After handing Pavel over to a Pakistani government soldier, Xia Jinyuan held her hand and led her to his troops. The entire airport that had fallen into darkness suddenly lit up. All the indicator lights on the runway also lit up. At the same time, several strong lights shone from the top of the airport building, illuminating the entire airport as if it was daytime. "See? That's how precious it is." The J5 took off his gray robe and pants and said to his comrades who were still looking at Q King, "You guys can take it off too. Don't tell me you're going to wait until the young lady gets in front of us before you take off your clothes. Q King can take it off, but you guys can't. You can't leave the young lady with the impression that you're impulsive. Otherwise, you'll scare her." After the instructor spoke, his comrades reacted one after another. The gray robes and pants that symbolized the members of Al-Qaeda were taken off at lightning speed. They also took off the headscarves wrapped around their heads. All of them were wearing long-sleeved shirts, bulletproof vests, and shorts. "Damn! Let's not take off our pants, shall we? Put them on, put them on." The T6 looked down at his legs. When the strong light shone on them, he realized that the hairs on his feet could be clearly seen. It was even more disrespectful. Chapter 5:11. T6 had a baby face that did not look old. His skin was also fair and tanned. Compared to V8, who had strong eyebrows, he seemed to be a few years younger. He looked as delicate and pretty as a college student. T6 was only wearing a pair of shorts that reached his knees. He immediately bent down to pick up the gray trousers he had taken off and said, "J5, you've caused a lot of trouble. It's rude of you to wear shorts. How impulsive." When V8 heard that, he immediately felt that it made sense. "Lil 6, you're the most reliable one. Lil 5 is a eunuch. He's so anxious every day that we're also anxious for nothing," V8 said as he bent down to pick up the trousers he had taken off. His expression was full of disdain for J5's words. "You guys have met Yi Qian several times, but this is the first time we're meeting. We have to make a good impression." J5 put on his trousers even faster. When he heard that, he spat, "Get lost, who's the eunuch? You two are the treacherous officials. You said you'd be a supporting character, but who are you trying to impress now?" G3 clicked his tongue and said, "Public morals are degenerating day by day. People's hearts are no longer what they used to be. Since you guys are all fighting to make a good impression, I can't fall behind." After saying that, when he bent down to pick up his trousers, he realized K7 had already put them on. He looked shocked. "Bro, you're so fast. It's troublesome. I've never taken them off before." K7 had always maintained the principle of saying as little as possible in front of his comrades. Everyone was so smart, so it was easy to guess. But wasn't it easy to guess? All of them cursed in a low voice. "Fuck, doctors are so cunning. Fuck." Next time, let him take them off first. His team spirit isn't strong. When we get back, let's get a week's worth of training uniforms. The strong light shone from the top of the airport building. Their shadows were very long. When they bent down, their shadows stretched out like a mountain peak. As for Yi Qian, he stepped on their shadows and walked over step by step. It's not cold. Why did you take them off and put them back on? Yi Qian, who had just arrived, did not know what was going on. He saw them take off their pants and put them back on in unison. He thought it was the drop in temperature that made them feel cold. Although that was what he said, he was muttering in his heart. The weather wasn't cold, and trained special forces soldiers like them could not only withstand the cold, but also the heat. How could they be afraid of the cold? Xia Jinyuan rubbed his forehead in the dark. With a smile on his handsome face, he said calmly, "To disguise myself, I had to wear the iconic gray robe and trousers of the Al-Qaeda members. Now that the mission is over, I can't wear them anymore, so I took them off." But in front of his little fox, Xia Jinyuan bluntly exposed his comrade's intentions. They had clearly agreed that if any of their girlfriends came over in the future, all of them would have to play the supporting role. Good heavens, they were still trying to leave a good impression in front of little fox. "Brothers, I'm sorry. Sometimes, I really have to value love over friendship." Halfway through his sentence, Yi Qian saw that he did not continue, so he casually asked, "But what?" But when they realized that they were only wearing a pair of shorts after taking off their trousers, and when they saw me holding your hand, they felt that it was a little rude to only wear shorts. They were afraid that you would have a bad impression of them, so they put them back on. Xia Jinyuan knew what his comrades were thinking. He did not hide it from Yi Qian and told him everything. So, don't be fooled by their imposing manner in battle. In private, they are just like all men. They care about their reputation. Chapter 5:12. Yi Qian was laughing so hard that tears were dripping from the corners of his eyes. The light in his dark eyes was even more dazzling than a strong light. You guys have a good relationship. Being from the same army is indeed different. In the past, because of his position in Fujian town and his young age, he needed to establish his prestige in front of the veterans. Therefore, Xia Jinyuan had to be a little imposing. Therefore, he didn't have much heart-to-heart with the soldiers. After arriving at the Snowfield Brigade, with the same military rank, the same position, and the same goal, what was needed was not an imposing manner, but a true comrade who could fight side by side with you. As soon as Xia Jinyuan entered the Snowfield Brigade, he was like a dragon returning to the sea. Everyone was the same. They fought in the same trenches all day, ate in the same cafeteria, and when they were free, they would lie on the lawn of the base and chat. Occasionally, they would even crack a harmless joke to lighten the atmosphere. Naturally, the relationship between the comrades was deep. Once the relationship was deep, there was no harm in teasing each other. There aren't many people in the army, so we eat and drink together. Everyone knows how many times each person went to the bathroom last night. Naturally, our relationship is deep. Xia Jinyuan deliberately slowed down his pace. The battle raged behind them, so it was time for them to rest. You'll know when you get to the army in the future. After interacting with each other for a long time, we're even closer than real brothers. However, it's hard to guard against such underhanded methods. Yi Qian liked this kind of topic of conversation. It made her feel relaxed. During the conversation, her slight smile was like a freehand landscape painting of a boat on a river. It was quiet and long, bringing a sense of serenity. I'm quite envious of you. You have a group of comrades who can share your life with you. I still don't know where I'll be in the future. Even if I get into the military academy, I'll still have to obey the arrangements. If I were to be sent to the front line, it would be fine, but if I were to be sent to the logistics team, I can only accept my fate. Every time she fought with them, she couldn't wait to join the army instead of sitting in school and studying peacefully. However, when she returned to school, she would be able to calm down and study seriously. Of course, it would be even better if she did not have those trivial matters to deal with. What's there to be envious of? Can't you just set me as your goal? Hunters would always inadvertently set up traps and wait for their prey to arrive. Just like now, in order to raise Yi Qian's goal, Xia Jinyuan casually brought it up in a relaxed mood. Yi Qian was really interested. After 3 rounds of cooperation, she guessed that Xia Jinyuan's troop was definitely a special force. She also heard him say that there were not many people in the troop. Generally, even if there were not many soldiers in a special force, there would be more than 30 people. Only some special forces would be limited to a small number of people. If that was the case, Captain Xia's unit was a special force with a special nature. Yi Qian's eyes lit up. She looked at him and said softly, "If I really set you as my goal, does that mean I have a chance to join you?" There weren't many bait that could make his little fox take the bait. The army was one of them. It was also the most useful one. He would mention the army from time to time, and his little fox would obediently follow him. Now, it was even better. She was using his army as bait. Very good. That was the effect he wanted. The effect was what he wanted, but it also made him nervous. He didn't know if it was right or wrong to bring her into his army. Chapter 5:13. If today's kidnapping had not happened, he would have insisted on his original plan and brought her to his military unit. Now, he would listen to her thoughts first, then take it one step at a time. His slender hand held hers tightly and did not let go. It was as if he was taking a leisurely stroll. If there was a crescent moon in the sky, he would be able to take a leisurely stroll under the moonlight. Xia Jinyuan raised his thin lips slightly and said with a faint smile, "My army. My military unit is a little difficult. If I said that even the best soldiers in Fujian Town's military unit might not be able to make it, would you believe me?" "Of course I believe you," Yi Qian answered without hesitation. She even looked a little serious. "You wouldn't joke about this kind of thing, so I believe every word you say." She always believed him like this. She did not need to think, nor did she need to think too deeply about it. She believed him so easily. Xia Jinyuan tilted his head and looked at her quietly with his dark eyes. He asked her softly, word by word, "Why? Why do you believe me so much? You don't even think about what I say to you and you subconsciously choose to believe me." This little fox, she definitely knew what he was thinking. The light in his black eyes became even more scorching, and his voice became softer, as if it was entangled with the smoke of gunpowder in the wind. It was also like a gentle net that surrounded Yi Jian. He asked her, "Do you know what I'm thinking in my heart? Am I right?" Yi Jian raised her head abruptly and looked into his dark eyes that were as deep as the sea. The light in his eyes made her heart beat wildly and her face seemed to turn red. Yi Jian naturally looked away as her breathing became irregular. Avoiding his burning gaze, she smiled and said, "Of course I know what you're thinking. You just want me to choose the military path in the future. Do you really think my thoughts are as you say?" With a smile in his eyes, Xia Jinyuan squeezed Yi Qian's hand and rubbed her fingers gently with his thumb. He conveyed the joy in his heart with his fingertips and also hinted to her that he had a lot of thoughts. When they were about 5 meters away from their comrades, Xia Jinyuan pulled her to the side and walked towards the darkness that even the strong light could not illuminate. Yi Qian's heart skipped a beat when she saw this. She instinctively said, "Xia Jinyuan, where are you taking me?" Because she understood, Yi Qian rejected him when he tried to do something. She refused to take their relationship to the next level. She was fine on her own and did not need someone to force their way into her world. She did not care about men and daughters forming a circle. She could draw a circle on her own. Ji Yang is not that big. I can't possibly take you out of the airport. Her reaction like a frightened rabbit made Xia Jinyuan's smile deepen. The man who just walked out of the smoke of war had a strong sexiness to him. He showed the might of a man everywhere. His long legs took large strides and Yi Qian had no choice but to run after him. Xia Jinyuan, let go of me first. I can't outrun you. Yi Qian grabbed his hand and tried to break free. But for a man, it was difficult to let go of the girl he wanted. Chapter 5:14. Especially for a man like Xia Jinyuan, who was extremely honest and loyal when it came to relationships. It wasn't easy for him to meet a girl who made his heart flutter. He patiently waited for her to bloom, for her to bear fruit, and then, for him to pluck her. During this entire process, he didn't want to let go of even half a step. His sexy smile was like the red wine in a crystal glass at night, intoxicating even before tasting it. Now, you don't have to walk past me. I'll hold your hand and walk. When we get there, I'll let go and watch you walk past me. Or, we can walk side by side. How about that? The double entendre made Yi Qian struggle stop for a moment. Was the hidden meaning in his words what she was thinking? Or was it another one of his casual teasing? No, it didn't seem like it. His gentle voice and attitude of never letting go were all indicative of his deeper meaning. That deeper meaning made her heart tremble slightly. Even if she wanted to ignore it, how could she so easily ignore the palpitations in her heart? She stopped struggling and let him lead her to a darker place without any light. Yi Qian didn't say anything else. If she did, she wouldn't know how to deal with these things that she had no experience with. Don't be in a hurry to answer. Just keep quiet. Her obedient silence made Xia Jinyuan's eyes darken slightly. Every time they met, he used all his skills. Time and time again, he went deeper and deeper. Time and time again, he hinted at her verbally. He wanted her to gradually accept it as she grew older. It was a natural acceptance, not an escape. His little fox, who was resistant to adult men, couldn't be impatient for instant success. Other than taking it step by step, there was no other way. Yi Qian had already pursed her lips. Then, the double entendre in his words was just as she thought. He did have some feelings for her. Captain Xia, you don't have to be in such a hurry to give me some information so early. I'll say the same thing again. There's still a long way to go. Yi Jian, who had been jogging with him, expressed her attitude in a very firm tone. So, I won't take it to heart, and I won't think too deeply about it. Yi Jian, who had been jogging with him, expressed her attitude. In my world, I only want to go higher and further. Instead of settling down in a corner or living a life of being a fish on the chopping block. Her attitude was firm, and she had no intention of dating at such a young age. Xia Jinyuan was not discouraged. It was because of her attitude that he was able to take things one step at a time. He smiled and said, "Of course, you're still so young. Don't think too much about these messy things. Think more about your studies and the military academy." It was clearly his double entendre that made her overthink things, and now, she was the one who was overthinking things. At the same time, Yi Qian felt even more helpless. Captain Xia, you're just here to tease me, aren't you? I'm not teasing you because you're too young. I don't want to scare you. Xia Jinyuan laughed. His deep laughter was full of mockery. I'm not joking, and I won't take back what I've said. It's entirely up to you. Yi Qian thought to herself, if this goes on, I'll be even more worried. Just one sentence was enough to make her feel uneasy. She was afraid that he would be angry at her for her attitude, but she didn't want to lie. She had to feign ignorance. The more she said, the more mistakes she would make. The less she said, the better. Shut up. Her silence made Xia Jinyuan's heart soften. No matter what he said, his little fox never questioned him. Her obedience and obedience really made him like it. Chapter 5:15. He liked the fact that she was occasionally obedient. When she was stubborn, it made his heart ache. He said softly, "Let me know if the wound opens again. We can treat it first." Yi Qian, who was being pulled along, pursed his lips and muttered, "Even if it's just a minor injury, it's going to become a serious injury because of you." His voice was as soft as a mosquito. For Special Forces soldiers like Xia Jinyuan, no matter how soft a voice was, it was still a voice. He chuckled when he heard the grievance in Yi Qian's voice. "Grievance? I saw it when you handed Pavel over just now. It's a scratch, similar to the one you get during training. It's definitely not a minor injury that will become a serious injury." "Then why are you asking me?" "To show that I care about you." They chatted back and forth. It was rare for them to find a moment to relax after a battle. It was the happiest time to have a good chat. For Xia Jinyuan, it was the same. After they were at least 20 meters away from their comrades in the Snowfield Brigade, Xia Jinyuan stopped and pulled Yi Qian to sit down with him. "Take a break. They still have things to tell us. We can go back a little later." He turned on his headset again and lazily said to his comrades who were still waiting for him and Yi Qian to go back, "Brothers, you've worked hard. You guys hold on for a while. I'll take a break with Yi Qian. Also, talk to her. After all, she's been a hostage for almost 10 hours. She's a little traumatized. She needs to be talked to in time." After he finished speaking, a few disdainful snorts were heard in the entire channel. J5 put on a fake smile and said, "Q King, I'm an instructor. I'm better at talking to people than you are. You should leave Yi Qian to me." "Thanks. I'll deal with my own problems. There's no need to trouble you guys." Xia Jinyuan would not allow his comrades to occupy his and Yi Qian's time. There were only a few days left before the overseas visit. By the time he returned to the army and she went back to school, he didn't know when they would meet again. It was not difficult to detect a strong possessiveness in his words, but Yi Qian did not take it to heart. Instead, he was worried about his rascally behavior. The mysterious and unpredictable Xia Jinyuan, the multifaceted Xia Jinyuan, the scheming Xia Jinyuan, the cold and ruthless Xia Jinyuan, no matter which side he was, she couldn't figure him out. Now that the rascal was here, he couldn't do anything to him. After he hung up, Yi Jian smiled and looked at him. "Captain Xia, I'm not traumatized. Don't talk nonsense. Even I have some psychological trauma. How come you don't?" The shameless Xia Jinyuan had the air of a rich playboy in the capital. When he raised his eyebrows and smiled, he looked both flirtatious and flirtatious. "You're quite traumatized. When I saw the gun you left behind, I almost shot the Pakistani staff member who accompanied you." He spoke with a smile, but his deep voice did not hide his ruthlessness. Yi Qian believed that he did have such an impulse at that time, but he suppressed it. "If I heard that one of my people was kidnapped, I would be so anxious that I would fight to the death." Her smile was very relaxed, and it floated over with the wind. Even Xia Jinyuan's eyes, which were filled with ruthlessness, became clear. "Captain Xia, your army is the front line, right?" When they talked about the army, he pulled her away. In fact, it was also to avoid his comrades. He did not answer immediately. Yi Qian said softly in the silence between them, "My goal is to enter the frontline army. Only then will I feel that my life is not in vain." Chapter 5:16. Going to the front lines. Becoming a world-class sniper like Uncle Chin, becoming an unshakable tree, even if she had to go through life and death, it would be worth it. This life was really worth it. Xia Jinyuan lay down, his body pressed against the cold ground. He looked up at the endless, dark sky. After a moment of silence, he said in a deep voice, "Then you have to work harder. We're not a team that you can join just by saying you want to." He seemed to be thinking about something as his tone was a little serious. Yi Qian, who was sitting down, turned her body to the side and quietly waited for him to bring up the mysterious special forces. What kind of team would gather such outstanding soldiers like Captain Xia and the others? They were brave and fearless, strong in combat, and had high overall quality. Even the standard equipment on them was better than the average combat team. All these things made her curious about this team and filled her with yearning. Her serious waiting made Xia Jinyuan narrow his eyes slightly. She was indeed very interested in the team he was in. Even though she didn't ask much, her actions already explained everything. "You've seen what the team is for. They rush to the most dangerous place. If you're aiming for the team we're in, that's great. But you have to continue working hard." Xia Jinyuan didn't say much. He only told her that the goal was good, but it was a little difficult. What was Yi Qian least afraid of? The one thing he was least afraid of was difficulties. His silence just now was actually because he was considering whether to let her become a member of the Snowfield Brigade. He had always thought of this, but tonight's kidnapping was a wake-up call for him. Female soldiers who were kidnapped ended up in a worse state than male soldiers. They suffered inhumane torture, both physically and mentally. Since the establishment of the Snowfield Brigade, they had never recruited female soldiers because they were afraid that female soldiers would suffer physical and mental harm. In recent years, the military headquarters had begun to propose this, but it hadn't been finalized yet because they were also worried about this problem. He had faith in Little Fox, but tonight's events had forced him to be more cautious. However, he didn't want to give up the opportunity to let her stand by his side. He was incomparably eager to put on the military uniform one day and fight side by side with her, to experience the smoke of war together. This kind of desire could not be suppressed. She was already so outstanding at such a young age, and there were still 6 more years. 6 years later, when she joined the army, how dazzling would she be? Just thinking about it now made him feel emotional. Why do I feel that Captain Xia is only giving me a taste of sweetness and not really letting me have a taste of the candy? Yi Qian, who was sitting, lowered her head and looked at the cold silhouette of her body even when she was lying down. She raised her eyebrows slightly and smiled. "It looks like I really have to work hard. No matter which unit I'm in, whether I can go to the front lines, I have to work hard before everything is set in stone." Smile was confident, proud, and fearless. Just as Xia Jinyuan said, Yi Qian was the least afraid of difficulties. The more difficult it was, the more she would conquer it. Xia Jinyuan, who was frowning in the dark, heard this and a trace of determination flashed across his eyes. He restrained his expression and said in a low voice, "There are still differences between frontline units and special forces. All I can tell you is that all the brothers in my unit are the best of the best." Chapter 5:17. Xia Jinyuan's voice was low and heavy, as if it was filled with molten iron. Combat, precision shooting, high-speed driving, electronic blasting, communication decoding, and flying in the sky and running on the ground, all of these are necessary. Yi Qian, you've only traveled less than 1,000 miles in your long journey. There are too many things you need to learn. You need to know how to drive all kinds of combat vehicles, use all kinds of domestic and foreign weapons, be proficient in all kinds of radio and communication devices, and learn how to assassinate, scout, and destroy. Little fox, you're just a beginner. It will take you at least 5 years to become an elite Special Forces soldier. If you really want to join my unit, then as long as you can meet the requirements in the next 6 years, my comrades and I will definitely welcome you. Meticulous selection and strict training over a long period of time had finally created the Special Forces members of the Snowfield Brigade with unique skills and extraordinary skills. Yi Qian's eyes sparkled when he heard what Xia Jinyuan said. He nodded vigorously, and his voice was filled with excitement. As long as there's a chance for me to learn, I will definitely make good use of it. She continued, you brought me to participate in the car training because you wanted me to become a Special Forces soldier, didn't you? How did the smart little fox become so dumb all of a sudden? The 4-year plan Uncle Chen and Uncle Jen drafted for you was based on the training plan of the Special Forces in the triangular state of the United States. But our requirements are stricter now, and we have more skills. Since she had the same thoughts, then he was definitely going to hold her hands. He would tell her how to proceed and support her on this path until the day she left the army. From the looks of it, your outstanding performance in several missions has already been noticed by the military. Otherwise, they wouldn't have proposed to let you be a student who went abroad for an interview this time. They also asked you to train with the motor vehicle soldiers within a month. Yi Qian, the military has high hopes for you. Now, you can either cherish it or give it up. Before the military orders are issued, there's still time. His words made Yi Qian's expression turn cold. He said in a low voice, Captain Xia, are you saying that there's a high chance that I'll join the frontline army? That's right. As long as you keep progressing at this rate, there will definitely be a place for you in the front line. He had been thinking about whether or not to let her become a member of the Snowfield Brigade. Now that he thought about it carefully, since the military had already taken notice of his little fox, wouldn't it be obvious that the military wanted her to follow her leader to secretly visit a war-torn country at such a young age? As such, his worries were not worth mentioning in the face of military orders. Xia Jinyuan, who had been keeping track of how much time he had left, used the strength of his waist to support his upper body, sat up nimbly, and said with a smile in his dark eyes, the most important thing for you now is to have good skills before you join the army, so that the military and the country can rest assured about you. In your first year of high school, Yi Qian, you have to work hard. Follow Uncle Chen more often and endure more hardships. It will be good for you. This conversation was the most serious one Xia Jinyuan had ever had. In the past, he had been hiding it, but now, he was truly involved in Yi Qian's life. Okay, I understand. Yi Qian nodded solemnly. The determination between his eyebrows was no less than that of a real soldier. After being reborn, she no longer wanted to be a coward for the rest of her life. She wanted to stand at the top of the mountains and look down on the past. Chapter 5:18. His little fox had already gone through basic training and had the basic skills and tricks that it could rely on to survive. Even the important training programs were being carried out one by one, and the results of the training were finally reflected in every operation. For example, this time, she was fighting alone in the enemy camp. With her wits, she completed a major task that even the leaders praised. She switched out all the gasoline and saved the lives of dozens of hostages. The smart little fox had already walked the path of a Special Forces soldier. At this moment, even though he couldn't see her face clearly, Xia Jinyuan had already sketched out her facial features in his mind. He thought about it deeply and repeated it over and over again in his heart. He knew that his little fox must be very charming at this moment. She had a pair of exceptionally calm eyes that were as bright as the stars and as deep as the water. She had a face that was as beautiful as a flower and as beautiful as water. When she smiled, she was like a blooming flower. When she faced the enemy, she was as cold as frost and snow. How could Yi Qian not be charming? Xia Jinyuan, who was expected to return in 10 minutes, jumped up. He stretched out his hand and gestured for Yi Qian to take his hand and stand up. All right, let's return to the team. They gave us 10 minutes. Any later and we'll be seen as they're really waiting for us. Naturally, it would take some time to hand over to the Pakistani government. 10 minutes would be enough. J5 and the others were waiting for the car arranged by the Pakistani government to arrive at the airport and send them back to the hotel. They didn't rush Xia Jinyuan. A soldier with a sense of time wouldn't miss the time to return to the team. When there was 1 minute left before the 10 minutes, two figures that had disappeared from everyone's sight gradually walked out from the darkness. The two figures walked in the same pace and had the same expression. V8 said softly, Yi Qian's military aura is quite similar to that of Q King. I heard from Z7 that Q King met Yi Qian when she was 14 years old. They've known each other for so long and she's often influenced by Q King. It's normal for their auras to be similar. J5, who had already noticed this, heard his comrades gasp and couldn't help but laugh. You're jealous, right? I'm jealous too. So, in order to have a girlfriend, I've long planned to get along with Yi Qian. I'm relying on her to introduce me to her. V8's sigh was different. It was a long sigh. They're considered childhood sweethearts. It's too late for me to catch a childhood sweetheart now. After being single for so many years, she's a few years older than Q King. With a handsome baby face and an occupation that couldn't be revealed, V8 had a painful experience of going on blind dates. Everyone in the unit knew that V8, who had gone on countless blind dates, didn't believe that he was a soldier. Every time he mentioned that he was a soldier, the girl on the blind date would always be suspicious. The more serious girls would ask to see his military officer certificate on the spot. How could they casually show their military officer certificate to others? In the end, in the eyes of the girl on the blind date, it would be seen as dishonest. V8, who had gone on blind dates during his vacation, had always failed and returned to the team. So, whenever he mentioned his girlfriend, his heart ached. K7 patted him on the shoulder to comfort him. Continue with the blind dates next time. Even a blind cat will catch a mouse. His cold and emotionless voice wasn't comforting him, it was attacking him. It had always been an honorable tradition in the Snowfield Brigade to insult their comrades. They were a bunch of bachelors and they wouldn't feel comfortable if they didn't insult their comrades. Chapter 5:19. Yi Qian, on the other hand, looked at the figures standing together. They were all about the same height. He pointed at two completely unfamiliar figures and said, one of them is V8, and the other is T6. You guys are really about the same height. Was this specially selected? Just like the National Flag Guards, all of you were carefully selected to be of the same height. They had to be the best of the best in the army, and they had to be of the same height. How difficult was it to gather all of them together? There's only one thing. It's just that it's slightly controlled, so there are fewer people in our army. When they were still 3 meters away from their comrades, Xia Jinyuan sped up his speech and said, their facial features also have to be well defined. It's extremely difficult. Yi Qian glanced at him quickly. Why did she hear a hint of smugness in his voice? They were so close, and they had been holding hands the whole time. Even if they only looked at each other from the side, there was an intimacy that no one else could interfere. Another collaboration. How many times have we worked together, Xiao Yi? J5 laughed heartily. It had been more than a year since the last battle in the snowy highlands. This time, he saw her fighting ability again. She saved more than 10 hostages by herself, saved the orphanage from an explosion, and remained calm in the midst of a crisis. J5 admired her. Yi Qian was like a returning comrade. He high-fived them to show that he was safe. His eyebrows were like crescent moons. This is our third battle. It's been a pleasure working together. This is our first time working with you. Similarly, it's been a pleasure working with you. It's also reassuring, V8 said. He raised his thick black eyebrows and said jokingly, "Guess who I am?" Xia Jinyuan smiled. His handsome face was filled with gentleness as he said to Yi Qian, V8, one of our comrades. He's partners with T6. They scored the highest in the tacit understanding test. They're proficient in many small languages. They're the best brothers. Proficient in many small languages. Yi Qian was in awe. When the T6 soldiers were introduced, Yi Qian had a better understanding of this mysterious special forces unit. The T6 soldiers were proficient in explosives, reconnaissance, assassination, armored vehicles, and infantry fighting vehicles. These were not a problem for him. With a gentle and handsome baby face, it was impossible to tell that he was a veteran, nor was it possible to tell that he was a soldier who was best at assassination. The car that was picking up the Snowfield Brigade members had already driven across the track and stopped steadily in front of them. The car door opened, and a young man in a suit stepped out of the car. The first thing he asked was, "Are you injured?" "The medical staff is at the airport. You can go over and treat the wound at any time." The situation in the transport plane was transmitted to everyone's ears through the tower's communicator. Several Pakistani government soldiers had been shot and had been sent to the hospital for emergency surgery, while the 2 Chinese special forces had not received any news of any injuries. Yi Qian, who was standing at the back, did not see clearly who the man who got out of the car was. When he opened his mouth, he knew that it was Qin Xiu, the professional interpreter accompanying the leader. "Everything is fine. No one is injured." J5 saluted him and replied coldly and calmly, "Thank you for your concern, leader. The mission has been completed. All members are on standby." Qin Xiu heaved a long sigh of relief and smiled elegantly. "That's good. The leader is still waiting for everyone at the hotel. Please get in the car first." He looked past the soldier who was almost 1.9 meters tall and finally saw Yi Qian standing at the back. He smiled at her and said, "Yi Qian, the leader wants to talk to you later. Be mentally prepared. It's not a bad thing, it's a compliment." This was the tone of an acquaintance. Chapter 520. Qin Xiu naturally knew Yi Qian, so he didn't use the same polite tone he used when speaking to the Snowfield Brigade. He was more or less casual. Not only was his tone casual, but he also turned sideways to let the Chinese soldiers get into the car first. When it was Yi Qian's turn to get into the car, he gently pulled her wrist and said, "You sit with me. They can get in first." Xia Jinyuan, who was about to help her into the car, stopped in his tracks and turned to look at Qin Xiu. He said in a deep voice, "Her arm is injured. We will need to treat it for her after we get into the car. Interpreter Qin, let her sit with me." This time, Qin Xiu recognized Xia Jinyuan, who was chosen by his mother as the best son-in-law. Based on this alone, Qin Xiu's attitude was gentle and polite as he said, "I'm sorry, I was reckless." He then said to Yi Qian, "You get into the car first and let them check on you. If you need to go to the hospital, we can immediately send another car to the hospital to treat it." Yi Qian didn't want to send another car to send her to the hospital. She raised her arm and said, it's just a graze. I can treat it myself. There's no need to go to the hospital. There was light in the car, and she was standing at the door of the car. Qin Xiu saw a burn on her arm. This was caused by a stray bullet hitting a hard object. It dissolved most of the bullet's power and changed its trajectory, causing a burn. It was one of the lightest bullet scratches. Then let's go to the car to treat the wound. There's a first aid kit in the car. Qin Xiu had seen gunshot wounds before, and he himself had suffered a graze before. He knew that there was no need to go to the hospital with this kind of injury. He didn't say anything else and helped Yi Qian up. Xia Jinyuan, who had already gotten into the car, held her wrist and got into the car. The medical kit was fully prepared. Xia Jinyuan placed Yi Qian's left hand between his knees. As the car rocked, he picked up a cotton ball dipped in saline with a pair of scissors and carefully treated her wound. Don't move. Steady your arm. Don't let the forceps touch your wound. Qin Xiu, who was sitting alone on the side, was about to stand up and support Yi Qian's shoulders when she heard this. However, she saw that Yi Qian had already grabbed the back of her chair with one hand and stabilized her swaying body. She had been kidnapped, and walked out of a hail of bullets. She was even injured, but he did not see anything strange on her face. There was not a trace of fear, as if she was already used to it. This was a bit strange. How could a student be used to a hail of bullets? Qin Xiu couldn't help but take another look. His gaze was fixed on Yi Qian's back, and there was a hint of doubt in his indifferent eyes. The wound is not deep, so you don't need stitches. However, there will be some scars. After Xia Jinyuan finished speaking, he used a bottle of saline to rinse the wound, applied some anti-inflammatory medicine, and bandaged it with sterile gauze. Don't touch unboiled water tonight. It might be inflamed. He looked up and instructed Yi Qian. When he put away the medical kit, his cold gaze seemed to inadvertently look at Qin Xiu. As if he had just realized that he was looking at Yi Qian, his thin lips curved slightly, revealing a polite but distant smile. Qin Xiu nodded slightly and calmly looked away. Both of them came from good family backgrounds and were rich young masters in the capital. The noble aura in their bones was not something that could be learned by others. They were born with a noble aura. This was a confidence that was engraved in their bones. It was not something that could be cultivated. The saying, "Nobility accumulates for 3 generations," was referring to these two people. A calm look was exchanged with a faint smile. Then, they looked away as if nothing had happened. Qin Xiu had already narrowed his eyes. This young master from a family Xia was indeed not bad. However, the old madam of the family Xia did not get along with the old madam of the family Xia. If he wanted to marry the daughter of the Qin family to a family Xia, it would be difficult to get past the old madam alone. Chapter 521. The Qin family and the Xia family were both old aristocratic families in the capital. Even if their ancestors went back 3 generations, there was still a genealogy. However, the Qin family and the Xia family were slightly different. The old master of the Qin family went abroad during the war and later returned to the country to become a diplomat. Only then did the Qin family take root in the capital again. Family Xia, on the other hand, did not go anywhere. When the war broke out, old Master Xia and his 5 brothers all gave up writing and joined the army. When the war ended, only 3 of the 5 brothers were left. Old Master Xia was the youngest, and now he was the only older member of the family Xia. Logically speaking, the 2 families were both aristocratic families in the capital and were somewhat related by marriage. However, in reality, there was no marriage at all. As a result, Qin Xiu's mother had to put in a lot of effort to marry her daughter into family Xia. Qin Xiu did not care about these things, but it was impossible for him to not care at all. Otherwise, how could he explain to his parents? However, Qin Xiu was also thinking about how to talk to Xia Jinyuan. Just now, even if it was just a glance, he could see that Xia Jinyuan had a condescending arrogance. This was not a display of arrogance, but a kind of noble heritage of an aristocratic family. It was obvious that Xia Jinyuan was not someone who was easy to get close to. Qin Xiu was the same. He looked gentle, but there was a sense of alienation in his bones that kept people thousands of miles away. After getting out of the car, Qin Xiu said to Xia Jinyuan, "Major General is waiting for everyone's report. I will take Xiao Yi to him first." "Sorry to trouble you, Interpreter Qin." Xia Jinyuan smiled at him politely, then said to Yi Qian, "You have been with him for 2 days. If he asks you anything, just answer truthfully. There is no need to deliberate." He was afraid that he would not have a chance to meet her tonight. After he finished reporting to Major General, she probably went back to her room to rest. Qin Xiu was a smart person. At this moment, he could tell that Yi Qian and Xia Jinyuan also knew each other. He stood to the side elegantly and did not say anything, quietly waiting for the two to finish talking. "Yes, I know." Yi Qian knew that Qin Xiu was worried that she would think too much and lose her honesty in front of the leader, so he reminded her to say whatever she wanted to say. No matter what, this elegant but dangerous man would always remind her appropriately and tell her what she should do. Xia Jinyuan wanted to raise his hand to rub her head again, but in front of so many comrades, he had to restrain himself. In the end, he gently patted her shoulder and said softly, "Leader is concerned. Leader is care." It was impossible for the leader to put on airs in front of a student. When he saw Yi Jian come in, her hands were wrapped in bandages, her face was covered with gray marks from the war, and her neat student uniform was wrinkled. He immediately said to Qin Xiu, "Quick, let the doctor come in and take a look at the child's injuries." Qin Xiu. Qin. Yi Qian. Afraid that the leader would call for a doctor, he said, "Translator Qin, you know. You don't have to worry about my injuries." Qin Xiu gently closed the door and stood to Yi Qian's left. He smiled and said, "It's indeed a minor injury. Our Chinese soldiers have already treated it in the car. You don't have to worry. It's not a big problem. It's considered a minor injury." There were 4 guards standing upright in the room. When Yi Qian came in, they glanced at him lightly. Their eyes were as sharp as a falcon's, making Yi Qian's hair stand on end. They were the guards sent by Zhang Nanhai to protect the leader's personal safety 24/7. Chapter 522. Even if it's just a minor injury, you still have to recuperate. You came with us, but let a child like you suffer. This is a foreign country. Child, there are some things that our country can't interfere with. I hope you don't mind. The leader stood up and walked over. His dignified and kind eyes stared at the girl who was praised by the Pakistani president. He patted her shoulder gently and said gently, "It's good that you're back safely. It's also our fault that we didn't make proper arrangements and let a child like you suffer so much." Long before Yi Qian came back, the leader had already reflected on himself. But how could this kind of thing be completely controlled? Both the Chinese and Pakistani sides had made careful arrangements. But who knew that the English teacher in charge of teaching Miss Petty was actually an Al-Qaeda member? From the old government to the new government, through layers of examination and verification, it was confirmed that the background was clean and there were no problems. The Chinese leader's visit to Pakistan was a secret visit. The only people who could stay in the presidential palace and know about this trip were people close to the president and trusted. Pavel represented the Pakistani government during the old government and attended a joint venture celebration banquet between China and Pakistan. Even so, there was still a problem. To me, it wasn't a hardship. On the contrary, I was quite happy about the kidnapping. Yi Qian sat down with the leader and pursed her lips into a smile. She had the innocence of a young girl and the fearlessness of a soldier. When the leader heard this, he was quite surprised. He wanted to let Yi Qian go back to rest early. Now, he asked with interest, why? Aren't you afraid? This young girl was quite interesting. She wasn't afraid of being kidnapped. Instead, she was happy. Moreover, from her expression, it was obvious that she wasn't just saying it casually. She really thought that it was a happy thing from the bottom of her heart. It was an honor for anyone to have a face-to-face meeting with a leader of the country. Making the leader interested in her topic wasn't just an honor. It showed that the leader valued her. Yi Qian faced such an honor calmly and indifferently. She smiled slightly and said, "I've been trained by the army for the past few years. Although it was unfortunate to encounter such an incident, it was the accumulation of actual combat experience for me. I'm not afraid of being laughed at, but when I was kidnapped, I was actually quite excited, thinking that I could finally practice." At this point, Yi Qian pursed his lips slightly, revealing a shy smile. "That was what I thought at the time, but when I found out who had captured me, I actually panicked." She spoke at a steady and calm pace. She talked about her fear at the time and her plans after the incident. Every word and every look in her eyes revealed her confidence. "The army groomed me in the hopes that one day, I can bring glory to the country. I'm just doing my best to repay the country and the army for their training." That was what she thought in her heart, and that was what she said. There was no need for her to think about it, and there was no need for her to think about it. She said what she thought. Qin Xiu, who had not left, listened quietly. He heard every word Yi Qian said. His calm expression hid the shock in his heart. She was just a high school student. What she could say and what she could do was far beyond anyone's expectations. Even the leaders were no exception. Chapter 523. The reason why the leader came to meet Yi Qian so late at night was also because he was worried that this student might be scared and wanted to have a heart-to-heart talk with her. In addition, China had decided to keep Yi Qian by Petty's side as a hostage. It wasn't that China didn't value her, but from the perspective of the relationship between China and Pakistan, they had no choice but to consider the big picture and make Yi Qian suffer. In the end, there were many things that she didn't say out loud, but she had already thought it through clearly. She even treated this kidnapping as an accumulation of actual combat experience. "Good child, you did very well. I'm very glad that I brought you with me on this trip. If it was another student, I'm afraid that they wouldn't be sitting here chatting right now, but would still be anxiously waiting. It was the right decision to let the local army raise you. You are now in your second year of high school and will soon become a third-year high school student. Study hard, and the door to the army will definitely be open for you." The leader had some understanding of Yi Qian's family situation, but regarding Yi Jifan's matter, the military couldn't possibly report it to the higher-ups. The country's leader, who had to deal with a myriad of affairs every day, couldn't possibly deal with a local official. The current situation was already very good. Yi Qian didn't need to fight for any special treatment. She would use her own hands to win the final victory. Because there were no changes to tomorrow's itinerary, they still had to visit a school. After about half an hour of talking, Qin Xiu, who was waiting by the side, received an internal call. It was from the army's major general, who had an urgent matter to report to the leader. The leader personally sent Yi Qian to the door and instructed Qin Xiu to make sure that the staff took good care of Yi Qian. Yi Qian could go back to rest, but Xia Jinyuan and the others couldn't. When they walked out of the door, they saw Xia Jinyuan and the others, who were already in their military uniforms, walking behind the army's major general. Their steps were orderly and dignified as they walked towards them. Their gazes met briefly, then they calmly looked away. The plan for tomorrow's trip would not change. Tonight, Xia Jinyuan and the others still needed to make careful arrangements. It would probably be 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning by the time they walked out of the leader's room. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Yi Qian, who had fallen into a deep sleep, suddenly opened his eyes. His left hand reached for the pistol under his pillow, and as he turned around to hide under the bed, he felt for the military dagger beside the bed. He stuffed the extra pillow under the blanket, pretending that he was still asleep and quietly waiting for the intruder to come in. Turning on the lights, Yi Qian saw Xia Jinyuan, who was dressed in camouflage, walking over with a cold gaze. His gaze fell on the bed disguised with pillows, and a smile suddenly appeared on his handsome face. Xia Jinyuan, who was dressed in green forest camouflage, had a combat helmet tucked under his arm. His handsome face was painted with a special camouflage oil that ruined the original lines of his face and reduced the contrast between the forest camouflage on his body and the surrounding environment. He stood beside the bed, his clear eyes smiling as he looked at Yi Qian, who stood up from the side of the bed. "It's 4 o'clock in the morning, Comrade Yi Qian. You need to come with us to a place." The entire process of him coming in and standing beside the bed took about 20 seconds. His little fox had already completed her camouflage from the top to the bottom of the bed, and even used a pillow to pretend that she was still asleep. Yi Qian stood up from the side of the bed when he heard his voice. Looking at him, who was dressed in forest camouflage, he vaguely guessed that he was going out to fight again. Yi Qian, who was no longer sleepy, smiled when he heard that he needed to go with them to a place. He looked at him with clear eyes and asked, "Do I need to disguise myself too?" Chapter 524. Of course. Go open the wardrobe and take a look. There are clothes prepared for you inside. You have 2 minutes to change and gather here. Xia Jinyuan took a deep look at Yi Qian, who already had a look of anticipation on his face. He couldn't help but smile even wider. However, in the depths of that faint smile, there was a darkness that Yi Qian didn't notice. He watched as she walked out. She was wearing a short-sleeved fitness shirt like a male soldier. She walked quickly to the wardrobe. When he looked up again, he saw that she had already opened the wardrobe door, revealing a pair of beautiful and straight calves. Even her ankles were beautiful. There was a camouflage bag at the top of the wardrobe. If she didn't straighten her body and tiptoe to look at it, she wouldn't have noticed it. After Yi Qian returned to her room, she opened the wardrobe and took out her clothes to take a shower. After opening the wardrobe door several times, she still didn't notice that there was a camouflage bag on top of it. She took the bag out and unzipped it. A brand new jungle camouflage training uniform was neatly pressed under a bulletproof helmet of the same color. "You actually prepared it for me. Captain Xia, why didn't you mention it to me?" Yi Qian took out the helmet and the camouflage uniform. She hugged the entire set and turned to the bathroom to change. After she closed the door, she heard the rustling sound of changing clothes. Xia Jinyuan's smile faded slightly and he smiled as usual. "When we decided that you would be going abroad for an official visit, the military prepared it for you. After you change, put on the helmet and pistol and come out. We'll wait for you outside." She was changing inside while he stayed in the room. It would be strange if the group of people outside didn't think too much about it. For the sake of her reputation, he had to avoid it. In 1 minute and 40 seconds, Yi Qian changed into her combat uniform, helmet, and face paint. In 1 minute and 55 seconds, she arrived at the rendezvous point. Her slender and straight figure was like a pine tree in an abyss. She could stand proudly in the frost and snow, and she could face the wind and rain. She looked refreshed in the jungle combat uniform and was full of fighting power. She was like a bamboo shoot that had broken out of the ground and was only waiting to grow. Xiao Jinyuan fixed his gaze on her. The moment he saw her, his eyes darkened. It was as if something heavy had accumulated in his pupils, revealing a repressed seriousness. That night, the little fox would truly go to war as a soldier. That night, his little fox's hands would be stained with blood as she fought for the country. War meant slaughter. He wondered if the little fox would still be afraid of it. If he saw his hands stained with blood, would he have nightmares? After all, it was so small. It had come too quickly, too suddenly. He had no way to fight for her again. The Major General and the senior leaders had already agreed. Yi Qian walked over to Xia Jinyuan with the might of a soldier. She stood at attention and saluted. She appeared in front of the 6 members of the Snowfield Brigade with the posture of a soldier. After she saluted, Xia Jinyuan and the other 5 people saluted back with a solemn look. They didn't stop at all. Standing in front of them was not a student, but a comrade. A comrade who was about to go to war with them. He was the person they trusted the most. He was a comrade who could forget about age and identity and take care of each other. He was a comrade who had gone through life and death together. Xia Jinyuan's eyes darkened. When he saw the girl in front of him who was as cold as a spear, a light slowly broke through the darkness in his eyes. Finally, a faint smile appeared on his face. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.